At 7:42 on the morning of August 17, 1942, Captain Paul Gunn crouched beneath the starboard wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane and watched two mechanics weld 50 caliber machine guns into the bomber's nose where the bombardier used to sit. The acetylene torch threw blue-white sparks across aluminum skin, the smell of burning metal mixed with eucalyptus from the tree line beyond the runway. Gunn was 43 years old, 21 years in the Navy before transferring to the Army Air Force 6 months ago when the war came and regulations bent. His hands trembled as he held the blueprint he'd sketched in pencil the night before. Not from fear. From 6 months without news from Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, where his wife Polly and their 4 children had been imprisoned since the Japanese took the city in January. The welder shut off his torch and lifted his mask. Sergeant Jake Morrison, 28, from somewhere in Arkansas, where he'd learned metalwork on farm equipment before the Depression took the farm. He studied the gun mounts with the careful eye of a man who understood that bad welds killed people. His voice came flat. "Captain, 4 guns up front like this, all that weight, this bird's gonna fly nose first into the ground." Gunn didn't look up from his calculations. "Then we move the radios aft. Weight is mathematics. Mathematics doesn't care about regulations." Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead with a rag that left a streak of carbon black across his temple. The temperature was already 86 degrees and climbing toward the 100-degree mark it would hit by noon. He glanced at the other mechanic, a kid named Peters who couldn't have been more than 19 and looked younger. "Sir, respectfully, moving radios doesn't change physics." Gunn finally raised his eyes. They were the color of steel wool, gray with flecks of something harder. "Then we'll change the physics." He stood and walked to the front of the A-20, placing one hand on the plexiglass nose cone that would be gone tomorrow, replaced with a solid aluminum structure to house the 4 Browning M2 machine guns Morrison had just mounted. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. 4 guns meant 256 pounds. Add another 200 pounds of ammunition in belts that fed from boxes behind the guns. 456 pounds in the nose of an aircraft designed to carry a bombardier, a Norden bomb sight, and not much else. The 5th Air Force was losing bombers faster than replacements arrived from the States. In July alone, the 3rd Attack Group had lost 11 A-20s trying to hit Japanese convoys from high altitude. The bombardiers couldn't hit moving ships. Basic physics again. Drop a bomb from 10,000 feet at a ship doing 15 knots, and by the time the bomb reaches sea level, the ship has moved 200 yards. The bombardiers compensated. The Japanese captains saw the bombers overhead and turned hard to port or starboard. The bombs raised white geysers in empty ocean. When the A-20s dropped lower to improve accuracy, the deck gunners shredded them. Captain Ed Larner had watched 3 of his crews burn into the Coral Sea the previous week. The men didn't burn long. The A-20 carried 1,200 gallons of high-octane fuel. Fire consumed everything in seconds. The Japanese were reinforcing New Guinea at will. Every convoy that reached Lae or Salamaua meant another 1,000 troops, another 20 artillery pieces, another month of fighting through jungle and malaria to push them back. General Douglas MacArthur had promised to return to the Philippines, but first he had to hold New Guinea, and right now, New Guinea was slipping through his fingers like water. Gunn had a different idea. If bombers flew low enough to skip bombs across the water like stones on a pond, they could hit ships at point-blank range. But first they had to survive the approach through the curtain of defensive fire every Japanese vessel could throw up. That meant overwhelming the deck guns with forward firepower before the ships could react. That meant turning bombers into strafers. The problem was simple in the way that all impossible problems are simple when you strip away everything but the core issue. The A-20 Havoc had 4 30 caliber machine guns in the nose. 30 caliber rounds bounced off ship armor like hail off a tin roof. Gunn needed 50 caliber guns, 4 of them, mounted where the bombardier sat, firing straight ahead, 1,700 rounds per minute combined. General George Kenney, the new 5th Air Force commander who'd arrived from the States 2 weeks ago with ideas nobody had tried yet, and a willingness to let crazy bastards like Gunn try even crazier things, had given him 1 week to prove the concept worked. 1 week before Kenney's superiors in Washington started asking questions about why valuable aircraft were being modified in violation of every technical manual ever written. Gunn was using 50 caliber guns stripped from wrecked P-39 and P-40 fighters that would never fly again. The pilots were dead, buried in graves marked with wooden crosses or steel helmets mounted on rifles, stuck bayonet first into the red dirt. The guns weren't dead. Gunn mounted them on a steel frame welded inside the nose compartment where the bombardier used to crouch over his Norden sight. Calculating wind drift and ground speed and the moment to press the release button. No more bombardiers. No more high-altitude bombing. Just guns and the men who would fly into point-blank range to use them. The weight shifted the center of gravity forward, 8 inches according to Gunn's calculations, done on the back of a maintenance log at 3 in the morning, when sleep wouldn't come, because his mind kept showing him images of Julia, his 12-year-old daughter, hungry in a camp where the Red Cross reported rations had been cut in half and medicine was running out. 8 inches meant the aircraft wanted to nose over, wanted to dive, wanted to plant itself into whatever terrain lay ahead, unless the pilot fought it every second with back pressure on the control stick. The test flight 2 days ago had almost killed the pilot. Lieutenant Barnes, 24 from Michigan, had volunteered because nobody else would, and because Barnes had a reputation for being able to fly anything with wings. The A-20 had climbed to 200 feet, nosed over, and dropped like a stone. Barnes had pulled back on the stick with both hands, straining against the hydraulic pressure, and managed to level out at 75 feet with the propellers close enough to the treetops to blow leaves into the air. He'd landed, taxied to the hard stand, shut down the engines, and climbed out. His flight suit was dark with sweat despite the morning cool. He'd walked directly to Gunn and delivered his assessment in 3 words. "It'll kill everyone." But then Barnes had paused and added something else. "But I brought it back, so maybe it won't." Gunn had spent the next 48 hours alone in the hangar. No sleep, coffee from a pot that stayed warm on a hot plate in the corner, the coffee getting thicker and more bitter as the hours passed, and he poured cup after cup while he recalculated and moved equipment and tested weight distribution with sandbags placed throughout the fuselage. He moved the radio equipment aft, moved the auxiliary fuel tanks, adjusted the tail trim tabs manually with a wrench and a level, and the kind of patient precision that looks like stubbornness to anyone watching, but is actually just a refusal to accept that something can't be done. The second test flight happened at dawn yesterday. Different pilot, Captain Larner himself, the squadron commander who'd lost 3 crews and wasn't about to ask another man to risk what he wouldn't risk himself. The A-20 had lifted off, climbed to 500 feet, and stayed there. Larner had flown it in circles for 30 minutes, testing turns and climbs and dives, putting the aircraft through every maneuver it might face in combat. He landed and walked over to where Gunn stood beside Morrison and Peters, all 3 of them silent, waiting. Larner's voice had been careful. "Flies like it's angry, like it wants to kill me, but it flies." That was yesterday. Today, 16 modified A-20s sat on the hard stands at Eagle Farm, each one loaded with bombs and ammunition, each one crewed by men who understood they were testing a theory that might be brilliant or might be suicide. In 6 hours, they would find out which. Gunn pulled a letter from his pocket, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn through in places. 4 months old, delivered by Red Cross through channels that moved with the speed of bureaucracy grinding against the chaos of global war. His daughter Julia's handwriting, neat and careful the way the nuns at her school in Manila had taught her. The words were simple. "Daddy, when are you coming home? We're very hungry." He folded it again and returned it to his pocket, looked at Morrison and Peters, both of them watching him, both of them young enough to be his sons. "Get some rest. Mission brief is at 1300 hours. Morrison hesitated. "Sir, if I may, are we ready?" Gunn turned away and began walking toward the operations building. Over his shoulder, his answer came quiet enough that Morrison had to strain to hear it. "We'd better be, because if we're not, New Guinea falls in 3 weeks." The briefing room at 1300 hours was a Quonset hut with a corrugated steel roof that turned the interior into an oven by midday. 42 men crowded onto wooden benches, pilots and co-pilots and navigators and gunners, all of them in flight suits despite the heat because They would be wheels up in 90 minutes, and there was no time to change. The walls were bare except for a map of New Guinea's north coast, with red pins marking Japanese positions and blue pins marking Allied airfields, the red pins outnumbering the blue by a ratio that nobody wanted to calculate. Captain Ed Larner stood at the front beside a blackboard where someone had drawn a crude representation of an A-20 attacking a ship. Larner was 31 but looked older, the kind of aging that happens in months during wartime, when every mission means watching friends die and knowing tomorrow might be your turn. He'd flown 63 combat missions since arriving in Australia 4 months ago. The life expectancy for bomber crews in the Southwest Pacific was 14 missions. His voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Gentlemen, shut up and listen, because I'm only explaining this once, and if you don't understand it, you'll be dead by 1600 hours. The room went silent. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines running up carried through the thin walls, mechanics doing final checks. Armorers loading belts of ammunition into guns that had never been fired in combat from the positions where they were now mounted. Larner continued. Target is Buna Airfield, north coast of New Guinea, 120 miles northwest of here. The Japanese have been using it to stage fighters and bombers that attack our supply lines. Intelligence reports 14 aircraft on the ground as of 0900 this morning. Our job is to destroy them before they get airborne. He tapped the blackboard with a piece of chalk. Here's what's different. We're not bombing from altitude. We're going in at treetop level. 50 feet, 240 knots. The new nose guns will suppress anti-aircraft positions. We hit them before they can hit us. Then we skip bomb any aircraft that survive the strafing. A hand went up in the second row. Lieutenant Frank Chen, 24, Chinese-American from San Francisco, navigator with a degree in mathematics from Berkeley, and a gift for calculating approach angles in his head, faster than most men could do it with a slide rule. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who wanted to understand, not challenge. Sir, what if the Japanese guns hit us during the approach? Larner didn't hesitate. Then we find out if armor plating works. Nobody laughed. The A-20 had armor behind the pilot's seat and around the fuel tanks. But armor was weight, and weight was already a problem, and the armor they had might stop rifle-caliber rounds but wouldn't stop 20-millimeter cannon shells that the Japanese used in their anti-aircraft positions. Larner moved on. Formation will be line abreast. 4 aircraft across, 4 waves deep. 16 aircraft total. We go in simultaneously from the southeast. The Japanese won't be expecting an attack from that direction because they think we can't reach Buna from our current fields. They're wrong. Captain Gunn calculated the range. We'll have 20 minutes over target. Then we're burning fumes on the way home. He paused and looked directly at Gunn, who stood against the back wall, arms crossed, face showing nothing. Captain Gunn has designed these modifications. He's tested them. He's staked his career on them. General Kenny has staked the future of the 5th Air Force on them. You gentlemen get to stake your lives on them. Questions? The room stayed silent. Not because there were no questions, but because everyone understood that questions wouldn't change what was about to happen. Larner nodded once. Wheels up at 14:30. Dismissed. The men filed out, boots scuffing on concrete, voices low as they talked among themselves with the forced casualness of people walking towards something that might kill them. Chen stopped beside Gunn on his way to the door. His words came quiet. Captain, mathematically speaking, what are our chances? Gunn met his eyes. Mathematically speaking, we're about to find out if theory survives contact with reality. Chen almost smiled. That's not an answer, sir. It's the only answer I have. At 14:28 hours, 16 A-20 Havocs lined up on the runway at Eagle Farm Airfield. The sound of 64 radial engines turning 1,200 horsepower each into noise and heat and thrust shook the ground. Gunn stood beside the runway watching them taxi into position, each aircraft spaced 200 feet behind the one in front. The pilots running through final checks while ground crews pulled wheel chocks and gave thumbs-up signals. General Kenny had driven out from headquarters to watch the takeoff. He stood beside Gunn, hands in his pockets, squinting against the sun that blazed down from a sky empty of clouds. Kenny was 53, white-haired, with the calm demeanor of a man who'd seen enough war to know that confidence was mostly a performance you gave to keep other men steady. He spoke without looking at Gunn. Paul, if this works, you'll have changed how we fight this war. If it doesn't work, I'll have to explain to Washington why I authorized modifications that killed 16 crews. Gunn kept his eyes on the lead aircraft where Larner sat in the cockpit, visible through the canopy glass, going through his pre-flight checklist one last time. General, if it doesn't work, you won't have to explain anything, because the Japanese will own New Guinea by October. Kenny grunted, which might have been agreement or might have been acknowledgement that Gunn was right, and they both knew it. You should be flying this mission. You ordered me to stay on the ground, sir. I did, because if something goes wrong, I need you alive to figure out what and fix it for the next cruise. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be up there. Gunn didn't respond. The lead A-20 was rolling now, gathering speed, the tail coming up as airspeed built. At 115 knots, Larner pulled back and the aircraft lifted, climbing at a shallow angle, the nose wanting to drop but Larner holding it up with steady pressure. The second A-20 was rolling before the first cleared the tree line, then the third, then the fourth. 16 aircraft in the air within 6 minutes, forming up in their line-abreast formation, 4 across and 4 deep. A wall of aircraft heading northwest toward New Guinea and a target that didn't know they were coming. Kenny turned to leave, then stopped. Paul, your family, any news? Gunn shook his head once. Nothing since that letter 4 months ago. Red Cross says they're alive, but conditions are deteriorating. Food rations cut, medicine running out, diseases spreading. When we take Manila back, we'll get them out. Yes, sir. When we take Manila back. Kenny walked to his staff car. Gunn stayed on the runway until the formation disappeared into the haze that hung over the Owen Stanley Mountains, the sound of their engines fading to silence. Then he walked to the operations building where the radio room monitored the mission frequency. He would wait there, listening to fragmentary transmissions, trying to piece together what was happening 120 miles away, knowing that silence meant either radio discipline or death, and having no way to distinguish between them until the aircraft either came back or didn't. The mission frequency crackled to life at 15:32 hours, static and interference, and then Larner's voice, distorted but clear enough to understand. Dragon lead, approaching target, descending to attack altitude. The radio operator, a corporal named Williams, who'd been doing this job long enough to keep his face neutral no matter what he heard, adjusted the frequency to reduce a static. Gunn stood behind him, hands gripping the back of Williams' chair hard enough that his knuckles went white. 15:34. Dragon lead, target visual, count 14 aircraft on ground, anti-aircraft positions, southeast perimeter. 15:36. Dragon lead, commencing attack run. Then nothing. 60 seconds of silence broken only by static and the hum of the radio equipment and the sound of Gunn's breathing. Too fast, too shallow. He forced himself to breathe slower. Deeper. Mathematics didn't care about anxiety. Physics didn't care about fear. Either the modifications worked or they didn't, and no amount of worry would change the outcome. 15:37. Larner's voice again, louder now, urgent. Guns, guns, guns! Pour it on! The sound of machine gun fire transmitted through the radio, a sustained hammering that went on for 10 seconds, 15, 20, then Larner again. Dragon 2 through 4, follow my approach. Dragon 5 through 8, take the north side. More gunfire. Voices overlapping. Target hit. Aircraft burning. Watch the flak. I see secondaries. 15:38. Chen's voice, high and tight. Dragon lead, AA positions, suppressed. Repeat, AA suppressed. 15:39. Different voice. One of the other pilots, excited. They're not shooting back. They're running. 15:40. Larner, calmer now, falling back into the mechanical efficiency of command. All Dragon elements. Skip bomb remaining aircraft. Watch your spacing. The sound of explosions transmitted through the radio, muffled by distance and electronic limitations, but unmistakable. Bombs detonating, fuel tanks erupting, ammunition cooking off. 15:42. Dragon lead, target destroyed, All aircraft destroyed, anti-aircraft positions neutralized, egressing southeast. 1543. Dragon lead to home plate, mission successful. 0 casualties. Repeat, 0 casualties. Returning to base. Williams turned in his chair and looked up at Gunn. The corporal's face showed the kind of relief that comes when you've been expecting to hear men die and instead hear them coming home. He managed 2 words. They did it! Gunn released his grip on the chair and stepped back. His legs felt unsteady. He walked to the window and stared out at the empty runway, where in 30 minutes, 16 A-20s would land and taxi back to their hard stands and shut down their engines. Every crew intact, every aircraft flyable, 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed, every anti-aircraft position silenced, 0 Allied losses. Theory had survived contact with reality. He pulled Julia's letter from his pocket again, unfolded it, read the words he'd already memorized. "Daddy, when are you coming home?" His voice came out as a whisper no one else could hear. 16 more weeks, maybe less. General Kenny arrived in the operations building at 1600 hours, 30 minutes before the A-20s were scheduled to land. He found Gunn in the briefing room, staring at the map on the wall, the red pins marking Japanese positions. Kenny's voice carried satisfaction. "I heard the radio transmissions. Congratulations, Paul. You just changed how we fight." Gunn turned from the map. "We proved it works on one target under optimal conditions. We need to prove it works consistently. And you will. I'm authorizing continuation of the modification program. I want 30 strafers ready for combat within 60 days. Kenny paused, studying Gunn's face. "That's not a request. That's an order." "Yes, sir." Kenny walked to the map and tapped one of the red pins. Rabaul, the Japanese stronghold in New Britain, where they staged their convoys, where they concentrated their air power, where they coordinated the entire New Guinea campaign from bases beyond the reach of Allied bombers flying from Port Moresby or Milne Bay. His next words came carefully. "The A-20 works, but it has limitations. Range is too short to reach Rabaul. Bomb load is too light for heavy shipping. I need you to solve a bigger problem." Gunn waited. Kenny continued. "I need you to do with the B-25 Mitchell what you just did with the A-20. Longer range, heavier payload, more guns. Can you do it?" The B-25 was bigger, heavier, more complex. Twin engines instead of the A-20's inline configuration. More crew positions, more systems that would have to be modified or relocated or simply accepted as problems that couldn't be solved. The weight issues would be worse. The center of gravity shifts would be more pronounced. The engineering challenges would be exponentially more difficult. Gunn's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, sir." "How long?" "Give me 60 days. Kenny nodded once. "You have 45. Because in 45 days, I need those B-25 strafers operational. The Japanese are planning a major convoy to reinforce Leh. Intelligence is already seeing indicators. When that convoy sails, I need to be able to stop it. High-altitude bombing won't work. You know it. I know it. The only thing that will work is your strafers." "Understood, sir." Kenny turned to leave, then stopped at the door. "Paul, one more thing. When you're done modifying the B-25s, I'm sending you to California. North American aviation needs to see what you've built. The factory engineers need to understand how to integrate your modifications into production aircraft. Washington wants me to scale this program across the entire Pacific Theater." Gunn felt something cold settle in his chest. California was east. Manila was west. Every mile east was a mile in the wrong direction. His voice stayed level. "Sir, my family. I know, and I promise you'll be back in the Pacific within 6 weeks. But right now, I need your expertise stateside. The 5th Air Force can't run on 16 modified A-20s. We need hundreds of strafers, and you're the only man who knows how to build them." Kenny left before Gunn could respond. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the corridor and faded. Gunn walked back to the window and watched the first of the A-20s appear in the distance, descending toward the runway, gear down, flaps extended. Larner's aircraft, then the others strung out in trail, each one intact, each one coming home. By December, the temperature in Townsville dropped to tolerable levels, which meant 90 degrees instead of 110. The hangar where Gunn worked on the B-25 modifications had corrugated steel walls that absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, creating an environment that never quite cooled down enough for comfort. He'd been working 18-hour days for 6 weeks, sleeping on a cot in the corner of the hangar, eating meals brought by mechanics who'd learned not to interrupt him unless absolutely necessary. Master Sergeant Roy Hendricks, 38, from Oklahoma, where he'd learned to fix farm equipment during the Dust Bowl years, and then barnstormer aircraft during the Depression, approached the workbench where Gunn was sketching gun mount configurations on a piece of butcher paper. Hendricks had the build of a man who'd spent his life wrestling with machinery that didn't want to cooperate, broad shoulders and thick forearms and hands scarred from decades of work that involved metal and heat and sharp edges. He stopped 3 feet from the workbench and waited until Gunn acknowledged his presence. "Captain, the B-25 is bigger than the A-20. Heavier, more complicated. You can't just bolt guns anywhere and expect it to fly." Gunn set down his pencil and looked up. "You're right. So we do it methodically." Hendricks moved closer and studied the sketch. 4 50 caliber guns in the nose where the bombardier position would be removed. 4 more in external cheek packs mounted on the fuselage sides. The top turret rotated forward so its 2 guns could fire ahead instead of just covering the top hemisphere. His finger traced the outline of the cheek gun mounts. "These external packs will create drag, slow us down, make us easier targets. Less drag than having the Japanese shoot us down." Hendricks grunted, which was his version of agreeing, while maintaining his right to point out problems. "And the weight? 4 guns in the nose, 4 in the cheeks, 2 in the turret. That's 10 forward firing guns, over 600 pounds of guns and ammunition, all of it forward of the wing root." Gunn was already pulling out a different sheet of paper covered in calculations. "Center of gravity shifts 8.4 inches forward. We compensate by moving the auxiliary fuel tanks aft, relocating the radio equipment behind the bomb bay, adding ballast in the tail section if necessary, and we adjust the horizontal stabilizer trim tabs." "You calculated all that?" 3 times, same answer every time. Mathematics doesn't lie. Mathematics also doesn't account for what happens when you actually try to fly the thing. Gunn stood and walked to the B-25C that sat in the hangar, its nose already opened up, the plexiglass bombardier station removed and lying on the floor beside a toolbox and a pile of 50 caliber guns that looked out of place in the context of an aircraft designed around precision bombing, not close-range strafing. He ran his hand along the metal skin of the fuselage, feeling the rivets under his palm, the slight give of the aluminum that bent microscopically under pressure and sprang back when the pressure was released. "Roy, I need you to trust me on this." Hendricks followed him to the aircraft. "Sir, it's not about trust, it's about physics. You add weight to the nose wants to drop. The aircraft becomes unstable. If it's unstable in combat, men die. If it doesn't carry enough guns in combat, men die anyway. The difference is whether they die because the aircraft doesn't fly right, or because the Japanese shoot them down before they can fight back. I'll take the first risk to eliminate the second one." They worked through the night. Hendricks welded gun mounts inside the nose compartment, while Gunn calculated and recalculated weight distribution. Peters, who'd transferred from Eagle Farm to Townsville because he'd become good at this specific kind of modification work, fabricated the external cheek packs from aluminum sheet metal and steel reinforcing straps. By dawn, the first B-25G prototype sat on the hardstand outside the hangar, looking wrong in a way that was hard to articulate. The solid metal nose where the plexiglass had been. The bulges on either side of the fuselage where the cheek gun packs protruded. The top turret rotated forward in a configuration the factory engineers had never imagined. Lieutenant Barnes, who'd survived the first A-20 test flight and developed a reputation for being willing to fly anything, arrived at 0700 hours. He walked around the B-25 twice, stopping to examine the modifications, then turned to Gunn. "You want me to fly this? I want you to tell me if it flies. And if it doesn't, then you bring it back and we fix it." Barnes climbed into the cockpit. Hendricks stood beside Gunn on the hardstand, both of them silent as Barnes went through his pre-flight checks. The engines caught and roared to life, twin radials turning Hamilton standard propellers, the sound echoing off the hangar walls. Barnes taxied to the runway, waited for clearance from the tower, then pushed the throttles forward. The B-25 accelerated down the runway, tail coming up, airspeed building. At 110 knots, Barnes pulled back on the control column. The nose lifted, then dropped. Barnes pulled harder. The nose lifted again, grudgingly, fighting him. The aircraft became airborne at 130 knots, 50 feet down the runway from where it should have lifted off. Climbing at an angle too shallow, the nose wanting to drop despite Barnes's efforts to keep it level. Hendrix's voice came flat. "It's going to crash." But Barnes was good. He trimmed the elevator, adjusted the throttle settings, found the combination of control inputs that kept the aircraft flying, even though it didn't want to. He climbed to 500 feet, flew a circuit around the field, and landed 20 minutes later. He shut down the engines and climbed out. His flight suit showed dark patches of sweat despite the morning cool. He walked over to where Gunn and Hendrix waited. His assessment came in 4 words. "Nose heavy, wants to drop." Gunn was already heading back to the hangar. Over his shoulder, his response was terse. "Then we keep working." 3 days later, after moving equipment and adding ballast and adjusting trim tabs and recalculating everything twice more, Barnes flew the second test flight. This time, the B-25 lifted off at the correct point on the runway, climbed at the correct angle, and flew for an hour without trying to kill him. When he landed and gave his report, his words were careful. "Flies like it's angry, like it's fighting me, but it flies." That became the standard. Not perfect, not easy, but functional. By mid-December, Gunn had 5 B-25s modified and ready for combat. General Kenny arrived to inspect them on December 18th, walking from aircraft to aircraft, examining the gun installations, asking technical questions that showed he understood exactly what Gunn had done and what problems had been solved to make it work. He stood in front of the lead aircraft and counted the guns visible from the front. 4 in the solid nose, 4 in the cheek packs, 2 in the forward-rotated top turret, 10 forward-firing guns that could put 1,700 rounds per minute into a target. He turned to Gunn. "This is twice the firepower of the A-20. "Yes, sir, and 3 times the range. The B-25 can reach Rabaul from Dobodura. The A-20 can't." Kenny nodded slowly. "I'm authorizing full-scale modification. I want 30 strafers operational by February 1st. That gives you 6 weeks. We'll have them ready, sir. I know you will, because on February 1st, I'm going to need them." Kenny paused, then continued. "Intelligence intercepted Japanese naval communications yesterday. They're planning a major convoy operation, 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, nearly 7,000 troops. Destination is Leh. If that convoy gets through, we lose New Guinea." Gunn felt his pulse quicken. "When?" "Late February, early March. Weather dependent. They're waiting for monsoon season when cloud cover will protect them from high-altitude bombing." Kenny's expression hardened. "Which means we need to hit them low. And the only weapons system we have that can do that is your strafers." "The B-25s will be ready, sir." "They'd better be, because if that convoy reaches Leh, everything we've fought for in New Guinea becomes meaningless. We'll be pushed back to Port Moresby, maybe farther, and the road to Manila becomes impossible." The words hit Gunn harder than Kenny probably intended. Manila, where Polly and the children were starting their 2nd year in Santo Tomas internment camp, where rations continued to deteriorate and disease continued to spread, and the Japanese camp commanders continued to ignore Red Cross protocols for prisoner treatment. Kenny seemed to read his thoughts. "Paul, I know what you're thinking. I know every day they're in that camp feels like a day too long. But the fastest way to get them out is to win this war. And the fastest way to win this war is to stop that convoy. So finish these modifications, train the crews, and when that convoy sails, we'll sink every ship and kill every soldier aboard. Then we move north, toward Manila, toward your family." Kenny left. Gunn returned to the hangar where Hendrix and Peters and a dozen other mechanics waited for instructions. He picked up a wrench and walked to the nearest B-25. "We have 6 weeks to modify 25 more aircraft. That's 4 aircraft per week, which means we work 16-hour days, 7 days a week, no exceptions. Anyone who can't maintain that pace can transfer out now." Nobody moved. Hendrix picked up a welding torch. "Then let's get started, sir." They worked through Christmas without stopping, through New Year's without celebration, By January 15th, they had 28 B-25 strafers operational and 3 more in final modification. The ground crews called them Gunn's Folly, but they called them that with something close to pride, because folly or not, these aircraft represented something nobody else had been able to do. Turn a bomber into a weapon that could destroy ships, and do it with field modifications using hand tools and scavenged parts, and sheer stubborn refusal to accept that something was impossible. On January 20th, a message arrived from Washington. General Kenny called Gunn to his office to deliver it personally. The office was a converted storage room in a building that had been a pineapple warehouse before the war, barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs and a map of the Pacific that covered one entire wall. Kenny didn't invite Gunn to sit. He handed him the message flimsy, 3 paragraphs typed on thin paper that military communications used because it was light enough to send via air courier. Gunn read it twice. The words were technical and bureaucratic and absolutely devastating. Wright Field Army Air Force engineers in Ohio had reviewed the B-25 modification blueprints. Their analysis concluded the modifications were aerodynamically unsound. Center of gravity shifts exceeded safe parameters. Forward gun weight created structural stress beyond design limits. Muzzle blasts from the 50 caliber guns would buckle fuselage skin. The aircraft were unsafe for combat operations. Recommendation: immediate grounding of all modified B-25s pending further engineering review. Gunn lowered the message and looked at Kenny. They want to ground the strafers. They want to ground every modified B-25 in the theater. 30 aircraft, the only weapon system we have that can stop that convoy. But we've proven they work. Barnes has flown 40 hours in the prototype. Larner has flown combat missions in the modified A-20s. The physics are sound. Kenny took the message back and dropped it on his desk. The engineers at Wright Field have PhD degrees from MIT and Caltech. They have wind tunnels and slide rules and computing machines. They have calculations that prove your modifications can't work. And they have the ear of General Arnold and every senior officer in Washington who believes engineers over mechanics. Then they're wrong. Paul, you're not hearing me. It doesn't matter if they're wrong. What matters is they have the authority to ground these aircraft. And if they ground them, that convoy reaches Leh unopposed. Gunn stared at the map on the wall. The red pins marking Japanese positions. The blue pins marking Allied airfields. The narrow corridor up the north coast of New Guinea that represented months of fighting and hundreds of casualties in a strategic situation so tenuous that one convoy could change everything. What do we do? Kenny leaned back in his chair. I'm flying to Washington next week. I'll be there when the Wright Field engineers present their findings to General Arnold. I'll present our operational results. I'll show them that your modifications work in combat, not just on paper. But Paul, I need you to understand something. If I can't convince them, this program ends. All of it. The A-20s, the B-25s. Everything goes back to high-altitude bombing and hoping we get lucky. And the convoy gets through. 7,000 Japanese troops land at Leh. We lose New Guinea, and the road to Manila becomes something we talk about instead of something we do. Gunn walked to the map and placed his finger on Manila. How long until the convoy sails? 6 weeks, maybe 8 if weather delays them. Then we have 6 weeks to prove the strafers work so well that not even Wright Field engineers can argue with the results. Kenny stood. That's what I was hoping you'd say, because I'm authorizing increased operational tempo. I want the strafers flying missions every day, hitting every Japanese target within range, building a combat record that's so impressive, Washington can't ignore it. Yes, sir. And Paul, one more thing. When I go to Washington, I want you to come with me. The engineers need to meet the man who designed these modifications. They need to understand this isn't just theory. It's combat-proven engineering done by someone who understands what works because he tested it by flying. Gunn felt that cold weight in his chest again. Washington was farther east than California, farther from Manila, farther from Polly and the children. Kenny saw his expression. I know, wrong direction. But if we don't go to Washington, if we don't convince those engineers, you'll never get close to Manila anyway, because we'll lose this war. The message traffic between Australia and Wright Field over the next 3 weeks read like an argument between people who lived in different worlds. The Wright Field engineers sent detailed analyses of stress calculations and center of gravity parameters and structural load limits. Gunn and his mechanics sent mission reports describing successful strikes against Japanese positions at Wewak and Madang and Alexishafen. The engineers responded with wind tunnel data. Gunn responded with photographs of destroyed Japanese aircraft and burning ships. By the end of February, 32 B-25 strafers had flown over 200 combat missions. They'd destroyed 47 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They'd sunk 12 cargo vessels. They'd suppressed dozens of anti-aircraft positions. They'd done all of this without losing a single strafer to structural failure caused by the modifications. And Wright Field continued to insist the modifications were impossible. On March 2nd, General Kenny received intelligence that changed everything. Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul, 8 transport ships carrying 6,900 troops, 8 destroyer escorts. Course, southwest through Bismarck Sea toward Leh. Estimated arrival, March 4th, dawn. Weather forecast, heavy cloud cover, monsoon conditions, visibility under 1 mile. Perfect conditions for the Japanese, impossible conditions for high-altitude bombing. Exactly the scenario where strafers would prove their worth or fail catastrophically. Kenny called an emergency briefing at Port Moresby for that evening. Every strafer crew in the theater, every pilot who would fly the mission that would decide whether Gunn's modifications were genius or folly. Captain Ed Larner stood at the front of the briefing room at 2200 hours. 63 men crowded onto benches, flight suits already on, knowing they would be airborne before dawn, knowing this would be the mission that defined everything. Larner's voice carried exhaustion and determination in equal measure. Gentlemen, tomorrow morning we're hitting the biggest Japanese convoy since Midway. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 7,000 troops. If they reach Leh, we lose New Guinea. If we stop them, we win this theater. He pointed to a map showing the convoy route. We'll have 12 B-25 strafers, 30 A-20s, Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters for top cover, P-38s to handle Zeros. The strafers attack at 50 feet, masthead height, point-blank range, skip bomb while the deck guns are suppressed. Get out before Japanese fighters arrive. Chen raised his hand. Sir, what happens if we take fire during the approach? Larner's answer came flat. Then we find out tomorrow. The briefing ended at 2300 hours. Nobody slept. They sat in the darkness outside the operations building, smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee and not talking much because there wasn't much to say. At 0400 hours, they walked to the flight line where ground crews had the aircraft ready, bombs loaded, guns charged, fuel tanks topped off. Gunn stood beside the runway watching them climb into cockpits and run through pre-flight checks. General Kenny stood beside him, both of them silent as engines roared to life and aircraft began taxiing into takeoff position. Kenny's voice came quiet enough that only Gunn could hear. Paul, if this works, you'll have vindicated everything you've built. If it doesn't work, I'll be explaining to Washington why I ignored their engineers and got 16 crews killed. It'll work, sir. You sound certain. I am certain, because mathematics doesn't lie, and physics doesn't care about opinions, and we've tested these modifications in combat. They work. Tomorrow we prove it beyond any doubt. The lead B-25 was rolling now, accelerating down the runway, rotating at the correct speed, climbing at the correct angle. Then the second, then the third. 12 B-25 strafers lifting into the darkness, their navigation lights blinking red and green against the black sky, forming up over Cape Ward Hunt, turning northwest toward the Bismarck Sea where a Japanese convoy steamed toward Leh, unaware that in 40 minutes they would face a weapon their Navy had never encountered before. Gunn watched until the last aircraft disappeared. The sound of engines faded. Kenny turned to leave, then stopped. Paul, whatever happens out there, you've already changed this war. Win or lose tomorrow, you've proven that field innovation can outpace bureaucracy. That's worth something. With respect, sir, it's not worth anything if we lose that convoy. Kenny nodded and walked to his staff car. Gunn returned to the operations building where the radio room would monitor the mission frequency, and he would wait for the next 2 hours, listening to transmissions that would tell him whether theory had survived contact with reality one more time, or whether Wright Field had been right all along, and he'd sent 63 men to die in aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly. At 0630 hours, 137 Allied aircraft assembled over Cape Ward Hunt, B-17s in the high box, B-25 strafers at wavetop altitude, A-20 Havocs filling the gap between, bow fighters and P-38s weaving above, watching for Japanese Zeros. The largest strike force the 5th Air Force had launched since arriving in Australia. Below them, the Bismarck Sea was gray and rough under low clouds that scraped the water. Visibility measured in hundreds of yards instead of miles. Weather that would have grounded bombers in any other war. But this wasn't any other war, and these weren't any other bombers. Captain Larner led the B-25 formation northwest at 75 feet, so low that salt spray from whitecaps hit the windscreen, and the aircraft bounced through turbulence that came from flying in ground effect over water that moved. Chen sat in the navigator's seat beside him, calling out headings, watching the clock, calculating distance and time, and the moment when they would see the Japanese convoy or overshoot it and waste fuel they didn't have for a second approach. At 0700 hours, Chen's voice crackled over the intercom inside Larner's B-25. Target should be visible. 5 miles. Larner strained to see through the gray murk ahead. Nothing. Just water and clouds and the occasional rain squall that reduced visibility to zero. Then a shadow, then another. Then the unmistakable silhouette of a transport ship, 8,000 tons of steel cutting through heavy seas, flanked by destroyers in screening formation. Larner's transmission went out to every aircraft in the strike force. Dragon lead, target visual, count 8 transports, destroyer screen, commencing attack run. The Japanese convoy saw them at 2 miles. Too late to turn, too late to scatter. Too late to do anything except open fire with every gun and hope. Larner's finger pressed the trigger button on his control column. 10 forward-firing guns erupted simultaneously. The sound inside the cockpit was deafening. The recoil shuddered through the airframe. Spent casings ejected from the guns and streamed past the windows. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the water in a pattern that looked like a ripsaw, cutting toward the lead transport, closing the distance at 4,000 feet per second, faster than the human eye could track. The rounds hit the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered, metal bent. Men died before they could even understand they were under attack. Larner held the trigger down, walking fire across the ship's bridge and forward gun positions, watching tracers punch through steel like paper. At 100 yards, Chen called out, "Bombs away!" 2 500-pound bombs released from the B-25's bomb bay. They fell in a flat trajectory, hit the water, skipped once like stones, and slammed into the transport's hull below the waterline. The 2-second fuses detonated inside the engine room. The explosion blew through 3 decks. Steam killed everyone in engineering. The ship lost power and began listing to port. Larner pulled up hard, banking left, clearing the way for the next B-25 in line. Behind him, 11 more strafers attacked in sequence, each one adding its firepower to the maelstrom, each one dropping bombs that skipped and hit and detonated inside Japanese ships that had no defense against this kind of assault. By 0900 hours, 5 transports were sinking or burning. 2 destroyers were dead in the water. The Japanese convoy was scattered across 40 square miles of ocean, and every modified B-25 was heading back to Port Moresby intact. In the radio room at Port Moresby, Gunn listened to Larner's transmission. "Home plate, this is Dragon Lead. Mission successful. All strafers returning. 0 casualties. Repeat, 0 casualties." Gunn walked outside. The sun was climbing toward noon. The sky was blue and clear and empty. In 6 hours, 12 B-25s would land, and he would hear first-hand accounts of what happened and how the modifications performed, and whether any problems needed fixing before the next mission. But right now, in this moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe Wright Field had been wrong. Maybe field engineering done with hand tools and chalk marks on hangar floors could outperform calculations done in wind tunnels with advanced mathematics. Maybe theory really could survive contact with reality when the theory came from someone who understood combat at a level that no engineer sitting in Ohio could comprehend. General Kenny found him standing beside the runway. "Paul, I just received confirmation. Complete convoy destruction, 8 transports, 4 destroyers, every single one sunk or damaged beyond repair. 6,900 Japanese troops dead or captured, Allied losses minimal. Gunn said nothing, just nodded once. Kenny continued. The Wright Field engineers are briefing General Arnold tomorrow morning. I leave for Washington tonight. When I arrive, I'm going to walk into that briefing and tell them that 12 impossible aircraft just won the most decisive naval engagement in the Southwest Pacific since Midway. And then I'm going to tell them to approve your modifications for immediate factory production. Yes, sir. Paul, you need to come with me. The engineers need to meet you. They need to understand that you're not some mechanic who got lucky. You're an engineer who solved problems they couldn't solve because you understood the operational requirements better than they did. When do we leave? Tomorrow night. We'll be in Washington by March 5th. You'll have 1 week to convince North American Aviation to integrate your modifications into production aircraft. Then you're coming back here. Because in April, I'm going to need these strafers operational for the next phase. And you're going to need to train the crews who fly them. Gunn looked toward the northwest, toward the Bismarck Sea, where ships were sinking and men were dying, and a battle was ending that would change the trajectory of the war in the Pacific. Beyond that, hidden by distance and the curvature of the earth, lay New Guinea and Rabaul and the Philippines and Manila, where his family waited in a camp where they'd been imprisoned for 14 months and would remain imprisoned until Allied forces fought their way north through every Japanese-held island between here and there. Every mission brought him closer, every convoy sunk, every Japanese position destroyed, every modification that worked despite engineers saying it couldn't, all of it measured in miles and weeks and the slow grinding mathematics of a war that consumed everything, fuel and ammunition and aircraft and men, and gave back only incremental progress toward objectives that seemed impossibly far away. But today, for the first time in 14 months, Manila felt reachable. Not close, but possible. His voice carried something that might have been hope if he'd allowed himself that luxury. 14 weeks, General. Give me 14 weeks and I'll show you modifications that will take us all the way to Manila. Kenny smiled. Paul, I'll give you whatever you need, because you just proved something important. You proved that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet. The formation reached the Japanese convoy at 0700 hours on March the 3rd, 70 miles northwest of Leh, where the Bismarck Sea churned under monsoon winds that drove whitecaps across gray water. Larner brought his B-25 down to 50 feet, close enough that he could see individual sailors on the lead transport's deck, scrambling toward their anti-aircraft positions, their movements frantic as they understood what was coming, but too late to matter. The transport Kyokusei Maru turned hard to starboard in a desperate attempt to present its stern to the attackers and minimize the target profile. 8,000 tons of steel and cargo and 1,200 soldiers below decks trying to execute a maneuver that required 30 seconds the ship no longer had. At 800 yards, Larner's thumb found the firing button. 10 guns erupted. The recoil transmitted through the control column into his hands, up his arms, a physical reminder that every action carried consequences measured in lead, in physics, and men dying at the receiving end. The rounds covered the distance in less than 2 seconds. They hit the Kyokusei Maru's superstructure at the exact moment the first Japanese gunner managed to traverse his 20mm cannon toward the incoming strafer. The gunner's chest exploded before his finger reached the trigger. The man beside him took 3 rounds through the head and torso and ceased to exist as anything recognizable. The bridge windows disintegrated. The captain died at his post, his final order unspoken because his throat was gone. Chen's voice came through the intercom, tight with the kind of control that comes from forcing fear into a box where it can't interfere with function. Bombs away, 2 seconds. The B-25 shuddered as 500-pound bombs released from the bay. Larner pulled back on the control column, banking left with 4 Gs, pushing him into his seat hard enough that his vision grayed at the edges. The bombs fell in a trajectory so flat they seemed to skim the wave tops. The first bomb hit water 20 yards from the Kyokusei Maru's hull, skipped like a stone thrown by a child across a pond, and punched through steel plating 4 feet below the waterline. The fuse was set for 2 seconds. The bomb penetrated the engine room before detonation. The explosion traveled outward through metal and machinery and human bodies at speeds that turned everything solid into fragments. The boiler erupted. Superheated steam filled compartments where men had been working seconds before, cooking them alive in temperatures that exceeded anything the human body could survive. The ship's power died. Emergency lights flickered on, then failed as electrical systems shorted. In the darkness below decks, soldiers who'd been sleeping or writing letters or playing cards tried to find the hatches that led topside. Most failed. The ship listed to port at an angle that made walking impossible and climbing a struggle against gravity and panic. 40 minutes later, Kyokusei Maru capsized. Of the 1,200 men aboard, 170 survived to be picked up by destroyers that had their own problems. The second transport, Teiyo Maru, attempted to run. The captain pushed throttles to their stops, demanding 15 knots from engines designed for 12 in calm seas and struggling to deliver 10 in the current conditions. The mathematics was brutal. The B-25 strafers were doing 240 knots. Distance closed at a rate that made evasion impossible and defense inadequate. 4 strafers bracketed Teiyo Maru from converging angles. The concentration of firepower was something naval architects had never anticipated, because naval doctrine assumed aircraft attacked from above, not from wave-top height, where the angle of fire meant every round that missed the ship hit the water behind it, rather than continuing upward into empty sky. The 50 caliber streams converged on the transport's deck from port and starboard simultaneously. Anti-aircraft crews died at their guns before they could fire a single round. The bridge crew died at their stations. The ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, took 3 rounds through the chest as he tried to reach the ship's intercom to order abandon ship. He maintained consciousness long enough to see the captain fall beside him. Then everything went dark. The strafers dropped 8 bombs. 5 hit. Teiyo Maru's hull was never designed to absorb that kind of punishment at close range. Steel buckled. Bulkheads failed. The ship broke amidships with a sound like the earth cracking open. Soldiers below decks didn't have time to understand what was happening before water rushed in through breaches that measured yards across instead of inches. The transport sank in 6 minutes. Survivors who made it topside jumped into the Bismarck Sea wearing full combat gear, rifles and ammunition, and packs loaded with everything an infantryman needed to fight once he reached shore. The weight dragged them under. Those who managed to shed their equipment found themselves swimming in water rough enough to exhaust a strong swimmer in minutes. The sea was 78 degrees, warm enough to avoid hypothermia, cold enough that fatigue would eventually win. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters strafed the destroyer Shikanami as it tried to screen the transports from the marauding strafers. The destroyer's anti-aircraft fire hit one Beaufighter, punching holes through the starboard wing and severing hydraulic lines that controlled the flaps. The Australian pilot, Flight Lieutenant Jack McPherson from Sydney, where he'd learned to fly crop dusters before the war made crop dusting irrelevant, kept coming. His forward guns raked Shikanami's deck from bow to stern in a sustained burst that lasted 8 seconds and expended every round in his ammunition bins. Japanese gun crews went down. When the B-25 strafers arrived 30 seconds later, Shikanami had no operational defensive positions. 3 strafers attacked from different bearings. The destroyer's captain tried to turn into the attack, presenting the narrowest profile. But a ship that displaces 2,000 tons doesn't turn like a fighter aircraft. Too slow. Bombs hit port side, starboard side, amidships. The destroyer didn't sink immediately. Modern warships are built with compartmentalization and damage control systems designed to keep them floating through everything except catastrophic magazine explosions. But Shikanami was finished as a fighting vessel. Fires spread through ventilation systems, flooding overwhelmed pumps. The crew abandoned ship 2 hours later, picked up by other destroyers whose captains understood they might be next. By 0900 hours, the Japanese convoy had scattered across 40 square miles of ocean. 5 transports were sinking or already gone. 2 destroyers were crippled. The remaining ships tried to make lay. The distance was 70 miles. They wouldn't cover 10. Larner led his strafers back to Port Moresby with ammunition bins half empty and bomb racks bare. The return flight took 90 minutes. Nobody spoke much over the intercom. Chen stared out the navigator's window at the Bismarck Sea passing below, his reflection visible in the plexiglass, his expression showing something that might have been shock or might have been the beginning of understanding what they'd just done. They landed at 1400 hours. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, refueling and rearming with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that speed mattered because the war didn't pause for maintenance schedules. Fresh bombs were loaded, ammunition belts were fed into gun systems that had fired thousands of rounds and would fire thousands more before the day ended. By 1430 hours, the strafers were ready for a second strike. Larner found Gunn in the operations building, standing over a map where intelligence officers had marked the last known positions of Japanese ships based on reconnaissance reports that came in from patrol aircraft orbiting the battle area. The positions showed a convoy that no longer resembled a convoy, just individual vessels scattered and burning and trying to survive. Larner's face showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from flying through combat that requires absolute concentration for periods that exceed normal human capacity for sustained focus. Captain, request permission for second strike. Finish them. Gunn looked at Kenny, who'd been monitoring radio transmissions throughout the morning, listening to fragmentary reports that told the story of a battle that was going better than anyone had dared hope. Kenny's decision took less than 3 seconds. Granted. Launch immediately. Don't give them time to regroup. At 1445 hours, 12 B-25 strafers and 20 A-20 Havocs departed Port Moresby for the second strike. The Japanese had no fighter cover. The Zeros that should have been providing air superiority had landed at Leh to refuel during the morning attack. They were still on the ground when the second wave arrived, lined up neatly on a runway that made them perfect targets for strafing runs that destroyed 6 aircraft before the others could taxi clear. The transport Ayo Maru had been damaged in the morning attack, listing 15 degrees to starboard, fires burning in the forward cargo holds. 1,800 troops still aboard because the damage to the engine room meant the pumps weren't working, and abandoning ship into rough seas with no prospect of rescue seemed like slower death than staying aboard and hoping for salvation that wouldn't come. 3 B-25s attacked Ayo Maru simultaneously. The transport's anti-aircraft guns were silent, the crews either dead or fled. The strafers dropped 12 bombs, 8 missed, 4 hit. The 4th bomb penetrated through the deck into the magazine, where shells for the ship's defensive guns were stored in racks designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophic detonation that happened when high explosive met high explosive in a confined space. The explosion was visible from Port Moresby, 130 miles away. A fireball that climbed 4,000 feet into gray sky, followed by a shock wave that rippled across the water and a mushroom cloud of smoke that took minutes to dissipate. When the smoke cleared, there was no wreckage, no floating debris, no survivors. The Ayo Maru and every man aboard had simply ceased to exist. 1,800 soldiers gone in 3 seconds, not killed in any conventional sense, vaporized, erased, made into constituent atoms scattered across the Bismarck Sea. Chen saw it happen. His B-25 was 5 miles away when the Ayo Maru exploded. The fireball lit up the inside of the cockpit with orange light that seemed unnatural against the gray of monsoon clouds. He watched the mushroom cloud rise and understood with absolute clarity that he'd just witnessed 1,800 men die, not 1,800 enemies. 1,800 men who'd had mothers and maybe wives and maybe children, who'd written letters home and complained about food and played cards and done all the things soldiers do when they're not fighting. All of them gone because bombs he'd helped drop had found a magazine. They landed back at Port Moresby at 1,700 hours. Chen climbed out of the aircraft, walked 10 feet from the hardstand, and vomited. The contents of his stomach splashed onto red dirt that had absorbed oil and fuel, and now absorbed the physical manifestation of moral horror. Larner found him there, bent over, hands on his knees, breathing hard. Larner's voice came quiet. "You okay, Lieutenant?" Chen straightened but didn't turn around. "We just killed 1,800 men in 3 seconds. I'm not sure okay applies to that, sir. They were going to kill our men in New Guinea, every one of them. They were soldiers carrying rifles and ammunition and orders to push us back into the sea." "I know that." Chen finally turned to face his pilot. I know they were the enemy. I know we had to stop them. I know all of that. But knowing doesn't make watching 1,800 men vaporize any easier. Larner didn't offer platitudes about the nobility of sacrifice or the necessity of war. He'd been flying combat long enough to understand that the men who struggled most with what they'd done were often the ones who understood it best. Lieutenant, you can feel bad about it and still do it again tomorrow if that's what's required. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Yes, sir. Get some food, get some sleep. We fly again at 0600. By evening, the entire Japanese convoy was destroyed. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Of the nearly 7,000 troops that had departed Rabaul 2 days earlier, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh, swimming ashore or rescued by the few vessels that survived long enough to pick up survivors before fleeing north. 2,700 were rescued and returned to Rabaul. The rest died in the Bismarck Sea, drowned or killed by bombs or burned by fire, or simply lost in water that didn't care about nationality or cause, or the fact that most of them were barely 20 years old. Allied losses totaled 4 aircraft, 1 B-17 hit by anti-aircraft fire during the initial high-altitude bombing run, 3 P-38s shot down by Zeros during fighter engagements that happened on the periphery of the main battle, 13 aircrew killed. The mathematical exchange rate was brutal and lopsided, and exactly what modern industrial warfare produced when one side possessed overwhelming tactical advantage and used it without mercy or hesitation. General MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. The Japanese Navy never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by convoy. The war in the Southwest Pacific had reached an inflection point where Allied air power, specifically strafer doctrine, had made traditional naval operations impossible for the enemy. The Wright Field engineers were drafting their formal report on the afternoon of March 3rd while the battle was still ongoing. Their conclusion remained unchanged from their preliminary assessment. The B-25 modifications represented unsound engineering. Center of gravity shifts exceeded safe parameters. Structural loading violated design specifications. The aircraft were unsuitable for sustained combat operations. Recommendation: immediate grounding, pending comprehensive review and possible redesign by qualified aerospace engineers with appropriate credentials and access to proper testing facilities. General Kenny received a copy of the report via teletype at 1800 hours on March 3rd. He read it once, walked to the communications center, and sent a message to General Hap Arnold in Washington. The subject line read, "Commerce Destroyer Modifications Approved for Production." The body contained one paragraph. 12 B-25 strafers destroyed entire Japanese convoy in Bismarck Sea. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, 6,900 enemy casualties. Allied losses minimal. Request immediate factory integration of forward gun package into all B-25 production aircraft. Wright Field assessment invalid. Combat results prove concept. Arnold received the message at 0800 hours Washington time on March 4th. He read it 3 times, then called North American Aviation's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, whose company built the B-25 Mitchell, and who'd been hearing rumors about field modifications happening in Australia that violated every engineering standard his people worked to maintain. Kindleberger's voice carried skepticism. "General, my engineers tell me these modifications are dangerous, unstable, not properly tested." Arnold's response was blunt. "Your engineers are wrong. I'm sending you the man who designed them, Paul Gunn. He'll show you how to do it right. General, with respect, we have aerospace engineers with advanced degrees who design aircraft for a living. We don't need a field mechanic. Captain Gunn just won the battle that saved New Guinea. His field modifications work better than anything your engineers have designed. He's flying to California next week. You'll integrate his modifications into your production line. That's not a request." The call ended. Kindleberger stared at the phone for 30 seconds, then called his chief engineer and told him to prepare for a visitor who would be explaining how to redesign their bomber production in ways that contradicted everything they thought they knew about aircraft design. Gunn didn't want to leave Australia. He made that clear to Kenny during the briefing on March 5th, where Kenny explained that Washington required his presence in California to work with North American Aviation on factory integration of the strafer modifications. His family had been in Santo Tomas internment camp for 14 months. Every intelligence report showed conditions deteriorating. Food rations cut again, medicine exhausted. Prisoners dying from malnutrition and disease at rates that accelerated as months became years. His voice carried frustration he rarely showed. General, Manila is west. California is east. Every mile I fly away from my family feels wrong. Kenny understood. He'd read the Red Cross reports. He knew what was happening in those camps. But strategic necessity didn't care about personal circumstances. Paul, you'll be back in 6 weeks. And when you come back, you'll bring blueprints for factory-built strafers. Hundreds of them. Enough to take the Philippines. Enough to liberate Manila. Enough to free your family, but first you have to go to California. 6 weeks. I promise, 6 weeks maximum. Then you're back in theater and we push north. Gunn flew out of Brisbane on March 27th aboard a C-54 transport that made the trip to California in 4 legs, with refueling stops at Canton Island, Honolulu, and San Francisco, before landing at Long Beach, where North American Aviation's plant covered 140 acres of what had been farmland before the war, made bombers more valuable than crops. 20,000 workers on 3 shifts, assembly lines running 24 hours daily. 1 B-25 rolling off the production line every 4 hours. Mathematical precision applied to industrial-scale manufacturing that turned raw aluminum and steel and rubber and countless other materials into finished aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible before the war made impossible just another engineering challenge to solve. Gunn carried a canvas bag containing hand-drawn blueprints, modification notes written on whatever paper had been available at the moment inspiration struck, and photographs of the strafers in combat. He walked into the factory's main engineering office at 0900 hours on March 28th and found himself facing Donald Morrison, chief engineer, 52 years old, MIT graduate, 25 years in aerospace design, a man whose entire professional identity was built on the foundation that proper engineering required mathematics and testing and validation through established protocols. Morrison spread Gunn's blueprints across a drafting table and studied them with the expression of someone examining evidence of a crime. His finger traced the gun mount locations, the weight distribution calculations, the structural modifications. When he finally spoke, his words were careful. "Captain, these aren't engineering drawings. These are sketches. They worked in combat, in the field, under non-standard conditions. For a factory, we need specifications, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, stress calculations verified by multiple engineers, wind tunnel data showing how modifications affect aerodynamics. We need proper engineering." Gunn's patience was already thin from 4 days of travel and 2 months of listening to engineers explain why things that worked couldn't work. "I tested it by flying. That's as proper as engineering gets." Morrison set down the blueprints and looked directly at Gunn. His next words came with the certainty of someone who'd spent decades in a profession that rewarded precision and punished improvisation. "Captain, that's not how engineering works. It's how winning works." They stared at each other across the drafting table, 2 men separated by education and methodology, in fundamental disagreements about whether reality validated theory or theory predicted reality. Morrison had degrees and decades of experience in the backing of an industry that valued credentials. Gunn had combat results and dead enemies and modifications that shouldn't work but did. Morrison broke the silence. "Fine, show me. Explain every modification. I'll have my engineers translate your fieldwork into production specifications. But I'm telling you now, if we find structural problems or aerodynamic issues that make these modifications unsafe, we're redesigning them. I don't care how well they worked in Australia." The next 2 weeks were a negotiation disguised as engineering review. Morrison's team identified problems. Gunn explained solutions. Morrison insisted on verification. Gunn demonstrated that verification existed in the form of 30 aircraft that had flown over 400 combat missions without a single structural failure. Morrison argued that combat success didn't prove the modifications were optimal. Gunn countered that optimal didn't matter if the alternative was losing the war. The center of gravity issue consumed 3 days of arguments. Morrison's calculations showed an 8.4-inch forward shift when 450 caliber guns were mounted in the nose along with ammunition. Gunn's field calculations had shown 8.2 inches. The difference was 2/10 of an inch. Morrison treated it like gospel truth. Gunn treated it like rounding error. Morrison pressed the point. Captain, 2/10 of an inch in center of gravity shift can mean the difference between stable flight and uncontrolled descent. Then how do you explain 30 aircraft flying successfully for 4 months? I explain it as luck, or pilot skill compensating for marginal stability, or conditions that happen to be favorable. But none of those things are acceptable bases for production design. Gunn walked to the window overlooking the assembly floor, where B-25s moved down the line in various stages of completion. Fuselages being riveted, wings being attached, engines being mounted, the industrial choreography that turned components into weapons. Mr. Morrison, I'm not arguing against proper engineering. I'm arguing that proper engineering includes acknowledging what works in actual combat. Your calculations are probably more accurate than mine. Fine. So we use your calculations, but we keep my modifications because they've killed 4,000 Japanese soldiers, and that matters more than decimal places. Morrison considered this. His expression shifted slightly, from certainty towards something that might have been respect. All right. We'll use my calculations to refine your modifications, strengthen the nose structure, redesign the gun mounts for better load distribution, add reinforcing around the cheek gun positions, calculate exact center of gravity compensation, and adjust tail trim accordingly. How long? 2 weeks to complete the engineering drawings, another week to build the first production prototype. Then we test. The muzzle blast issue emerged during detailed design review. The 50 caliber guns produced significant blast pressure when fired. Morrison's aerodynamics team calculated that the blast would buckle the aluminum skin around the cheek gun mounts, potentially causing catastrophic structural failure at high speed. Morrison presented the data with the confidence of someone whose mathematics had just proven an opponent wrong. The muzzle blast pressure exceeds the yield strength of the aluminum skin in this area by 40%. The metal will deform, possibly crack, definitely create aerodynamic problems. Gunn looked at the calculations, then at Morrison. It does. The metal peels back around the gun ports after about 50 hours of flight time. Morrison's expression showed vindication. Then the modification is unsafe. I welded blast deflector tubes that extend 6 inches beyond the gun muzzles. Channels the pressure away from the skin. Problem solved. You welded tubes to a bomber fuselage? It worked. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then turned to his engineering team. Design blast deflectors, integrated into the gun mount structure, properly engineered, not welded on as an afterthought. By May 10th, the first factory-built B-25G strafer rolled off the assembly line. 4 50 caliber guns in solid nose. 4 more in external cheek packs. Top turret rotated forward. And one modification that hadn't existed in any of Gunn's Australian conversions. A 75mm M4 cannon in the forward fuselage, the same gun used in M3 Lee tanks, firing the same ammunition, capable of holding a destroyer below the waterline with a single shell. Morrison had proposed the cannon during a design review meeting in late April. The idea was audacious enough that half the engineers in the room thought he'd lost his mind. Mounting a tank gun on a bomber violated every principle of weight distribution and recoil management that governed aircraft design. Morrison had explained his reasoning with the calm logic of someone who'd done the mathematics. If we're redesigning this aircraft anyway, why not make it capable of engaging heavier targets? A 75mm shell carries enough kinetic energy to penetrate ship armor. One hit could disable a destroyer or sink a transport. The strafers already attack at point-blank range. Why not give them a weapon that makes each attack run more lethal? Gunn had considered the proposal for approximately 10 seconds before responding. Can the airframe handle the recoil? We'll reinforce it, add structural members around the cannon mount, distribute the recoil loads through the frame. What about rate of fire? The 75mm requires manual loading. How fast can a crew member reload a tank gun while flying at 240 knots? We estimate 1 round every 30 seconds with a well-trained loader. Gunn had nodded once. Then let's try it. The test flight happened on May 12th. Gunn insisted on piloting, not because he didn't trust the factory test pilots, but because if something went catastrophically wrong, he wanted to understand what and why so fixes could be implemented before the next aircraft. They flew to a test range off the California coast where naval targets had been positioned for weapons evaluation. At 8,000 feet, Gunn lined up on a decommissioned destroyer hull that had been anchored as a stationary target. The cannon fired with a sound that transmitted through the airframe as much as through the air. The recoil was 4 feet of rearward travel absorbed by hydraulic buffers and structural mounts and 12,000 pounds of force trying to push the aircraft backward against forward momentum. The entire B-25 shuddered. Gunn's vision blurred from vibration. His teeth rattled. Every instrument on the panel bounced. The navigator sitting behind him swore continuously for 5 seconds. The shell hit the destroyer hull amidships, penetrating through steel plate and detonating inside with enough force that fragments exited the far side. If the destroyer had been a functional warship, that single hit would have killed everyone in the engineering spaces and probably flooded 2 compartments. Gunn landed, climbed out, and found Morrison waiting on the tarmac with an expression that mixed hope and concern in equal measure. Morrison's question was direct. Will it work? For ships, maybe barges. Anything slow enough that we can line up a shot and the navigator can reload between passes, but nothing faster. The recoil is manageable but brutal, and 30 seconds between shots means we get 2, maybe 3 chances per attack run before we have to break off. So it works? It works. North American Aviation built 400 B-25G strafers with a 75mm cannon. Then they improved the design. The B-25H model added 4 more 50 caliber guns to the cheek packs, bringing the total to 14 forward-firing guns. 8 in the nose, 4 in the cheeks, 2 in the forward-rotated top turret. The cannon remained, but with an improved recoil system that reduced the loading time to 20 seconds per round. The H model became the most lethal anti-shipping weapon in the Pacific theater. The B-25J followed in January 1944. The factory engineers removed the 75mm cannon after operational analysis showed that 50 caliber guns were more effective for most targets, and the cannon's weight and complexity weren't justified by its limited use cases. They added 4 more 50 caliber guns, bringing the total to 18 forward-firing guns. No bomber before or since has carried more forward armament. The J model could put 230 pounds of lead per second into a target. Mathematics applied to violence at rates that exceeded human comprehension. North American Aviation built 4,900 B-25J strafers. They delivered the first ones to the Pacific Theater in October 1943, 10 months after Gunn had walked into their factory with hand-drawn sketches and an attitude that proper engineering meant whatever worked in combat, regardless of whether it matched textbook theory. Gunn returned to Australia in May. Kenny met him at the airfield in Brisbane. 6 weeks had become 9, but the delay had been necessary to complete the engineering integration and verify that production aircraft matched or exceeded the performance of field modifications. Kenny's first question wasn't about the aircraft. It was about Gunn. "How are you holding up?" Gunn's answer came flat. "My family has been in Santo Tomas for 16 months. Red Cross reports say conditions are worse. They're not getting enough food. Medicine is gone. People are dying. And I just spent 9 weeks in California arguing with engineers about decimal places, while my wife and children starve. So I'm holding up poorly, sir." Kenny had known the answer before asking, but had asked anyway because sometimes acknowledging reality was more important than pretending everything was fine. "Then let's get to work, because the strafers are about to win this war, and winning means liberating Manila, and liberating Manila means getting your family out." The strafers evolved through the rest of 1943 and into 1944. Operational experience drove modifications that Gunn implemented in theater before factory engineers could design them. Some B-25s carried 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets under the wings. Some carried napalm tanks, jellied gasoline that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius and stuck to everything it touched. Some carried parafrag bombs, small fragmentation weapons with parachutes that allowed the strafer to drop them from minimum altitude without catching itself in the blast radius. The most effective tactic became the combined strike. B-24 Liberators would bomb from 20,000 feet, forcing Japanese anti-aircraft gunners to look up, to track high-altitude targets, to concentrate fire on threats above. Then the strafers would come in at 50 feet. By the time the gunners looked down, adjusted their aim, traversed their weapons toward targets moving at 240 knots, barely above the water, it was too late. The strafers were already on them, guns hammering, bombs dropping, rockets firing, creating destruction that overwhelmed defensive responses through sheer concentration of violence applied faster than human reaction times could process. In the first 8 months of 1944, 5th Air Force strafers destroyed 947 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They sank 273 ships. They killed an estimated 38,000 enemy soldiers. The numbers were clinical, precise, the kind of statistics that look clean on after-action reports, but represented individual human beings ceasing to exist because the mathematics of modern industrial warfare favored the side with better logistics and more innovative tactical doctrine. Gunn flew missions he didn't have to fly. He was a lieutenant colonel now, promoted in September 1943 as reward for work that had fundamentally changed how the 5th Air Force prosecuted the war. Staff officers didn't fly combat, but Gunn wasn't staff in any meaningful sense. He was an engineer who happened to hold rank and happened to design modifications that saved lives by taking other lives more efficiently. Hendricks asked him about it one evening in October after Gunn returned from a mission against Japanese positions at Wewak. They were in the hangar where mechanics were repairing a B-25 that had taken anti-aircraft damage, replacing sections of wing skin that had been shredded by 20mm cannon fire. The kind of damage that looked catastrophic but could be fixed in 18 hours by men who'd learned to work fast because the tempo of operations demanded it. Hendricks's question was direct. "Colonel, you're 44 years old. You've flown 60 combat missions. You're headquarters staff. Why do you keep flying?" Gunn was inspecting damage to the wing root, checking whether the structural spars had been compromised or if the damage was purely cosmetic. He didn't look up when he answered. "Because every mission takes me closer to Manila." "Sir, with respect, you're not getting closer to Manila by flying missions out of New Guinea. The Philippines are 1,000 miles northwest. We're not even fighting in the same theater. Every Japanese soldier we kill here is one less soldier defending Manila. Every ship we sink is one less ship supplying their garrison. Every aircraft we destroy is one less aircraft providing air cover when we invade. So yes, Roy, every mission gets me closer." Hendricks didn't argue. He'd learned that Gunn's logic was sometimes circular, but always arrived at conclusions that justified whatever Gunn had already decided to do. "And if you get killed on one of these missions, then someone else will finish the modifications, and someone else will fly the strafers, and eventually someone else will liberate Manila. But until that happens, I'm flying." The intelligence reports from Santo Tomas grew worse through late 1943 and into 1944. Food rations had been cut to starvation levels. Rice and vegetable soup once per day, sometimes less. Prisoners were dying at rates that accelerated as malnutrition weakened immune systems and tropical diseases found hosts with no resistance. The Japanese camp commandant had informed the Red Cross that if Allied forces approached Manila, all prisoners would be executed. The threat wasn't idle. Japanese military doctrine regarding prisoners was clear. They were resources to be used or eliminated depending on strategic circumstances. Gunn received these reports through intelligence channels that passed them along as clinical information, data points that informed strategic planning about the challenges of liberating occupied territory where enemy forces held hostages. He read them in his quarters late at night when sleep wouldn't come, and his mind showed him images of Julia, who would be 14 now, and Nathaniel, who would be 11, and his younger children whose faces were becoming harder to remember because 16 months had become 24, and memory faded when it wasn't reinforced by presence. On November 2nd, 1943, Major Ben Fridge led 4 squadrons of strafers into Rabaul Harbor. 137 Allied aircraft total, 59 B-25s. The harbor held 38 Japanese vessels, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, cargo ships, minesweepers, Everything the Japanese Navy needed to support operations across the Southwest Pacific concentrated in one location because Rabaul represented their last major stronghold that could project power throughout the region. The strafers came in at masthead height through white phosphorus smoke that blinded anti-aircraft gunners and created conditions where defensive fire became random, spraying into clouds that reduced visibility to tens of feet. The strafers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously: north, south, east, west. The Japanese couldn't track them all, couldn't concentrate fire, couldn't do anything except shoot blindly and hope. In 15 minutes, 30 ships were hit. 5 sunk outright when bombs penetrated below waterlines and detonated in engine rooms or magazines. 12 damaged beyond repair, fires spreading through fuel systems, or flooding overwhelming pumps, or structural damage so severe that the vessels would never sail again. The rest limped away with casualties and holes, and the understanding that Rabaul Harbor was no longer safe. Gunn flew that mission. He was in the cockpit of a B-25 attacking the heavy cruiser Otago, a warship that displaced 13,000 tons and carried 10 8-inch guns and represented everything the Japanese Navy had learned about building ships that could dominate sea battles. The Otago's anti-aircraft fire was intense even through the phosphorus smoke. 25mm guns and 40mm guns and machine guns, creating a curtain of lead that filled the air between the water and the clouds. Gunn's bombardier released 4 bombs at 100 yards, 3 hit. The cruiser listed to port, fires visible along the superstructure, damage severe enough that the Otago would spend the next 8 months in repair yards instead of supporting operations. When Gunn pulled up and banked away, his hands were shaking on the control column, not from fear, from the adrenaline dump that came after sustained high-stress focus, from pushing a 44-year-old body through maneuvers that left younger men exhausted. He landed back at base and climbed out of the aircraft. Hendricks was waiting on the hardstand. The crew chief's expression showed concern that he kept carefully controlled because expressing concern to a superior officer required tact. "Colonel, you okay?" Gunn stood beside the aircraft, steadying himself against the fuselage, breathing harder than the exertion justified. "Manila is 300 miles north of here. I can see it from this distance." "Sir, you can't see 300 miles. I can see my family, Roy. That's what matters." By December 1943, the strategic situation had shifted fundamentally. The modified B-25 strafers had become the decisive weapon in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese forces could no longer move supplies by sea in daylight. Their attempts to move supplies at night were increasingly countered by radar-equipped strafers that could find targets in complete darkness and attack with precision that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Their air forces were being destroyed on the ground faster than replacements could be flown in from Japan. Their army garrisons were isolated, undersupplied, increasingly unable to conduct offensive operations or even maintain defensive positions against Allied advances. General MacArthur was planning their return to the Philippines. The tentative date was October 1944, 10 months away. The road north would require taking islands one at a time: Hollandia, Biak, Morotai, Leyte, each one defended by Japanese forces who understood they were fighting a delaying action but fought anyway because surrender wasn't culturally acceptable and retreat meant death from Allied aircraft that controlled the skies. Gunn received orders in late December to report to 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane. General Kenny wanted to discuss the next phase of strafer development, new modifications for new targets. The war was evolving. The weapons had to evolve with it. Kenny's office had expanded from the converted storage room into a proper headquarters suite with maps and communications equipment and staff officers who coordinated operations across a theater that stretched from New Guinea to the Philippines to the Solomon Islands. Kenny stood at a map showing the planned advance toward Manila, the route marked with arrows and phase lines, and dates that represented months of fighting compressed into cartographic symbols. He turned when Gunn entered. "Paul, I need 300 strafers operational by October. Can you do it?" "We have 60 now. That's 240 more in 10 months. Factory production will deliver 150. We need to modify 90 in theater." "Yes, sir, we can do it." Kenny nodded, then moved closer to the map. His finger traced the route from New Guinea to Leyte. "When we land in the Philippines, the strafers will provide close air support. They'll suppress beach defenses, They'll destroy Japanese reinforcements before they can reach the landing zones. They'll do everything they did at Bismarck Sea, except over land instead of water. And when we take Leyte, we push to Manila. And when we reach Manila, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't have to. Both men understood what reaching Manila meant. Gunn's voice was quiet. How long until we liberate Santo Tomas? Best estimate? February or March 1945. 14 months from now. Maybe less if things go well. Maybe more if they don't. My family will have been in that camp for 3 years by then. I know, and I'm sorry it's taken this long. But Paul, we're winning. Your strafers are winning. Another year and this war is over. Another year and your family is free. I need you to hold on for another year. Gunn stared at the map, at the red symbol marking Manila, at the distance that separated him from the people who mattered most. A year, 12 months, 52 weeks, 365 days. The mathematics of time measured in ways that felt simultaneously too long and not long enough given everything that still had to happen before Allied forces could fight their way into Manila and open the gates at Santo Tomas and reunite families that had been separated by war and geography and the grinding bureaucracy of military campaigns that moved at speeds determined by logistics and strategy rather than personal urgency. He spoke without turning from the map. 14 months, General. I'll give you 300 strafers. You give me Manila. Deal. The strafer campaigns through 1944 followed a pattern that became almost mechanical in its efficiency. Intelligence identified targets. Mission planners calculated approach vectors and egress routes and fuel requirements. Ground crews armed aircraft with the specific weapons mix each target demanded. Pilots flew, bombs fell, ships sank or aircraft burned or supply depots exploded. Reports were filed, the cycle repeated. In April, 16 Japanese barges attempted to move troops and supplies along the coast near Finschhafen. The barges were wooden, shallow-draft vessels that could navigate close to shore where larger ships couldn't operate. They moved at night to avoid air attack. 5th Air Force radar operators detected them anyway. B-25 strafers arrived at dawn when the barges were still 20 miles from their destination, caught in open water with no cover and no defense except a few deck-mounted machine guns that were useless against aircraft attacking at 240 knots. Lieutenant Mike Rodriguez, 25, from New Mexico, where his father had worked copper mines before the Depression, led the attack. His B-25 came in low enough that the prop wash kicked spray off the wave tops. 18 forward-firing guns opened up at 600 yards. The wooden barges disintegrated. Splinters and bodies and cargo went into the water. 16 barges destroyed in 8 minutes. Rodriguez's after-action report was 3 sentences. Target destroyed, 0 friendly casualties, returning to base. By May, strafers had perfected night operations using SCR-717 search radar that could detect ships through clouds and darkness. Chen, promoted to captain and assigned as squadron navigation officer, spent weeks developing tactics that let crews bomb targets they couldn't see with their eyes. The radar painted returns on a screen that looked like green phosphorescence on black glass. A ship showed as a bright blob. Empty ocean showed as nothing. The bombardier released based on radar range and bearing rather than visual acquisition. The first night attack happened on May 15th against 12 Japanese cargo ships anchored in Wewak Harbor. The strafers approached at 100 feet in complete darkness. No moon, overcast sky, visibility measured in tens of feet. The radar guided them to release points. Bombs fell based on calculations rather than sight. When the strafers egressed and circled back to assess damage, fires lit the harbor. 9 of 12 ships were sinking or burning. Modern technology had eliminated the last sanctuary the Japanese Navy possessed: darkness. In June, strafers hit oil facilities at Balikpapan on Borneo. The facility refined crude oil into aviation fuel and ship bunker fuel that supplied Japanese operations throughout the Southwest Pacific. Destroying it meant cutting supply lines more effectively than sinking individual tankers. B-24 Liberators bombed from high altitude to crater the refinery infrastructure. B-25 strafers came in low with incendiary ammunition and napalm tanks. The napalm ignited on contact. Jellied gasoline stuck to metal surfaces and burned at temperatures that melted steel. Storage tanks ruptured, pipelines exploded. The refinery burned for 6 days. Smoke was visible from 100 miles away. Intelligence estimates suggested the facility would be offline for at least 8 months. Reality proved more pessimistic. The Japanese never fully restored operations. By war's end, Balikpapan produced less than 20% of pre-attack capacity. Japanese forces adapted. They stopped moving supplies in daylight entirely. Convoys traveled only at night, hugging coastlines, using islands for cover, dispersing when reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead. The adaptation bought time, but not victory. 5th Air Force countered by coordinating with PT boats, fast patrol craft armed with torpedoes and heavy machine guns that could locate Japanese convoys at night and illuminate them with searchlights at the moment of attack. The tactic worked like choreography. PT boats would patrol likely convoy routes. When they detected Japanese ships through radar or sound detection equipment, they would shadow at distance, radioing position and course to overhead strafers. At the moment of attack, the PT boats would close at high speed and switch on searchlights that turned night into day for the critical seconds the strafers needed to acquire targets visually and release weapons accurately. By the time the Japanese gunners adjusted to the lights and started shooting back, the strafers were already on them and the PT boats were racing away into darkness. A Japanese destroyer captain, Commander Koji Nakamura, survived one such attack in July. His after-action report, captured when Allied forces took Hollandia in September, described the experience from the receiving end. We could not see the aircraft, only muzzle flashes and the sound of engines. The searchlights blinded our gunners. By the time we could aim, the attack was finished and our ship was burning. This is not war. This is execution. He was right. The strafer doctrine had evolved beyond tactical innovation into something closer to industrial-scale violence applied with assembly line efficiency. Find target, attack target, destroy target, move to next target. The Japanese Navy and Air Force were being systematically dismantled by a weapon system that most military planners hadn't believed could work 18 months earlier. Gunn flew his 47th combat mission on September 10th against Japanese positions at Madang. He didn't need to fly. Staff officers, even those with combat experience, typically didn't participate in operations once they reached field-grade rank. But Gunn had never operated according to typical protocols. His rationale remained unchanged from the explanation he'd given Hendricks months earlier. Every mission brought him closer to Manila. The logic was flawed, but the motivation was pure. Hendricks tried reasoning with him again after that mission, catching him as he climbed down from the aircraft. Flight suit dark with sweat despite the morning cool. "Colonel, you're 44 years old. You've proven everything you need to prove. Let the younger men fly combat." Gunn pulled off his leather helmet and ran a hand through hair that had gone completely gray over the past year. "The younger men are flying combat. I'm just along to see how the modifications perform." "Sir, the modifications perform exactly like you designed them to perform. You don't need to validate that by risking your life every week." "Roy, my wife weighs 89 pounds. My daughter weighs 63. They're eating rice soup once a day in a camp where people are dying from malnutrition. Every report that comes through intelligence channels is worse than the last. The Japanese camp commandant has told the Red Cross that all prisoners will be executed if we approach Manila. So yes, I do need to keep flying. Because the faster we destroy Japanese positions, the faster we advance north, the faster we reach the Philippines, the faster my family stops starving." Hendricks understood that arguing was pointless. Gunn had constructed a mental framework where flying combat missions directly contributed to liberating his family. The causal chain was tenuous but unbreakable. "Yes, sir. Just be careful. Careful is how you lose wars, Roy." By October 1944, the 5th Air Force had 312 operational strafers, B-25 variants carrying different weapon configurations depending on mission requirements. Some mounted the 75mm cannon for anti-shipping work. Some carried maximum 50 caliber gun loadouts for ground attack. Some were configured for night operations with radar and specialized navigation equipment. The diversity represented 2 years of continuous field modification, driven by operational necessity and Gunn's refusal to accept that any configuration was final. American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines on October 20th. The invasion fleet was the largest assembled in the Pacific theater to that point. 700 ships, 200,000 troops, air cover from 18 escort carriers, plus land-based aircraft operating from New Guinea. General MacArthur waited ashore at Palo Beach and delivered his famous promise, "I have returned." The cameras captured the moment for propaganda purposes. The strafers operating overhead made the moment possible. For 3 days before the landing, B-25s had pounded Japanese airfields across Leyte and Mindanao and the Visayas, destroying aircraft on the ground and cratering runways and suppressing anti-aircraft positions. For 3 days during the landing, strafers provided close air support, attacking Japanese defensive positions that threatened the beachhead, hitting reinforcement columns before they could reach the landing zones, interdicting supply lines that would have sustained prolonged resistance. The Japanese threw everything they had at the invasion fleet. Kamikaze aircraft, pilots flying bomb-laden planes directly into ships in suicide attacks that represented the ultimate expression of a military culture that valued death over surrender. The kamikazes damaged several ships and sank one escort carrier, but the majority were shot down by fighter cover or anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. The strafers couldn't stop kamikazes already airborne, but they could destroy them on the ground before launch. Every Japanese airfield within range became a target. Gunn flew multiple missions daily during the Leyte operation. His commanding officers stopped trying to ground him. General Kenny had given explicit orders that Colonel Gunn could fly whenever and wherever he chose, because Gunn's tactical innovations continued to produce results, and because Kenny understood that some men needed to fight their way through war rather than direct it from headquarters. Manila was 300 miles northwest of Leyte. The strategic plan called for securing Leyte first, then Mindoro, then Luzon, then finally the assault on Manila itself. Intelligence estimated the timeline at 3 to 4 months. February or March 1945, Santo Tomas internment camp would be liberated as part of the Manila operation. Gunn calculated the days remaining: 105, 104, 103. The countdown never stopped. On November 27, 1944, at 0330 hours, Japanese bombers hit Tacloban airfield on Leyte. 56 aircraft, Mitsubishi G4EM Betty bombers, escorted by Zero fighters. They came in low from the north, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection until the last possible moment. The radar operators detected them only 2 minutes before the first bombs fell. Gunn was in the operations tent reviewing mission plans for the morning strike package. The tent was situated 200 yards from the main runway, close enough that when the first bombs hit the runway, the blast wave knocked him off his feet. The canvas walls absorbed shrapnel that would have killed him if he'd been outside. He hit the ground hard, breath driven from his lungs, ears ringing from the overpressure that accompanied high explosive detonations in proximity. The second wave of bombs walked toward the operations area. Gunn heard them coming, the whistle of falling ordnance that every combat veteran learns to recognize and fear. He tried to stand. Another blast wave knocked him down again. Something hot hit his left leg. Another fragment struck his shoulder. The pain came as immediate sharp agony that quickly spread into a burning sensation that suggested nerve damage or arterial bleeding or both. The medical officer, Captain James Sullivan from Boston, where he'd practiced emergency medicine before the war, made emergency medicine a military occupation, found Gunn trying to crawl toward the flight line. Blood soaked through Gunn's uniform trousers, dark and spreading. Sullivan had seen enough combat casualties to recognize immediately that the leg wound was serious. His voice cut through the chaos of continuing explosions and anti-aircraft fire and aircraft engines starting as pilots scrambled to get fighters airborne. "Colonel, stop moving!" Gunn's response came through clenched teeth. "Need to check my aircraft." "Your aircraft are fine. You're bleeding to death." Sullivan grabbed Gunn under the arms and dragged him toward the medical tent that had been set up behind the operations area. Far enough from the runway to have some protection from bombing, but close enough to receive casualties quickly. 2 corpsmen took over, lifting Gunn onto a stretcher and carrying him inside where other wounded were already being treated. The shrapnel fragment had severed the femoral artery in Gunn's left leg. The fragment in his shoulder had lodged near the collarbone, but hadn't hit anything critical. Sullivan worked fast. Tourniquet above the leg wound to stop the bleeding, pressure bandages, plasma to replace volume, morphine for pain. The surgery happened in the field hospital at Lady, a converted warehouse with operating tables improvised from wooden doors laid across sawhorses and lighting provided by generators that ran continuously because the power grid was either destroyed or unreliable. The surgeon was Major William Patterson, 36 from Philadelphia, who trained at Johns Hopkins before the war and had become expert at battlefield medicine through 20 months of practice on casualties that ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to injuries so catastrophic that all he could do was administer morphine and hold hands while men died. Patterson repaired the severed artery using sutures that were designed for abdominal surgery because proper vascular surgery supplies hadn't arrived with the initial medical loads. The procedure took 90 minutes. Gunn remained conscious throughout because the morphine dose was calibrated to manage pain without inducing unconsciousness that might complicate monitoring of vital signs. Patterson's prognosis was clear when he finished. "Colonel, you won't fly again for at least 6 months, probably longer. The artery repair needs to heal. The leg needs time to recover strength. You're looking at extensive physical therapy before you can even walk normally, much less handle the physical demands of flying combat." Gunn's response came without hesitation despite the morphine and the pain and the exhaustion. "Not retiring until my family is free. Colonel, this isn't about retirement. This is about medical reality. Your leg sustained major trauma. Pushing too hard too soon means permanent disability or death if the artery fails. Then I'll push carefully, but I'm pushing." Patterson had dealt with enough stubborn patience to know when argument was futile. "Fine. 6 weeks of bed rest, then we'll reassess. But Colonel, you need to understand something. This injury qualifies you for medical discharge. You've served 26 years between the Navy and Army. You've earned the right to go home. No one would question it." Gunn stared at the tent ceiling, canvas stained with smoke and blood, and the residue of 18 months of field hospital operations. His voice came quiet enough that Patterson had to lean closer to hear. "Captain, I'm not going anywhere until my family's free. You can discharge me or keep me on duty status or do whatever paperwork you want. But I'm staying in theater until we take Manila and open Santo Tomas. That's not negotiable." American forces fought through Manila street by street starting February 3, 1945. The Japanese had declared the city a fortress. They would defend every building, every block, every intersection. The fighting was brutal in ways that jungle combat never approached. Urban warfare meant close-quarters battle where artillery and air support risked hitting friendly forces and where the enemy could be anywhere, behind any window, in any basement, on any rooftop. Santo Tomas internment camp was liberated on the first day of the battle. Flying columns of tanks and infantry fought through Japanese defensive positions and reached the camp at 1600 hours. 3,700 Allied prisoners were freed. The conditions inside shocked even veterans who'd seen every variation of human suffering the war had produced. Prisoners were skeletal. Disease was endemic. The camp hospital was filled with people dying from malnutrition and dysentery and tuberculosis and infections that would have been treatable with proper medicine, but were fatal without it. Gunn's wife Polly weighed 89 pounds. Her pre-war weight had been 125. 3 years of starvation rations had consumed muscle and fat until her body was barely functional. His daughter Julia, now 15, weighed 63 pounds and looked like photographs from concentration camps in Europe. His son Nathaniel, 12, had recurring malaria that the camp doctors had treated with quinine until the quinine ran out, then treated with nothing except hope that immune systems would fight off infections that killed weaker prisoners. His youngest daughter, Sarah, 9, had severe dysentery that would require weeks of treatment even with proper medical care. Gunn flew to Manila on February 4th against explicit medical orders. His leg was still bandaged. The sutures from the artery repair hadn't been removed yet because the recommended healing period was 8 weeks and only 5 had passed. He walked with a cane that he'd acquired from somewhere and refused to explain where or how. Patterson had cleared him for light duty only, which specifically excluded flying. Gunn interpreted light duty to mean whatever he decided it meant. He commandeered a C-47 transport by the simple expedient of walking to the flight line at Leyte and informing the pilot that he needed immediate transport to Manila. The pilot, a first lieutenant who'd been in theater long enough to know who Colonel Gunn was and what he'd done, didn't ask for orders or authorization. He just started pre-flight checks and told Gunn to climb aboard. Santo Tomas had been converted into a makeshift hospital. Army medical personnel had moved in within hours of liberation, setting up treatment stations and distributing food and medicine, and attempting to triage 3,700 patients who all needed care immediately. Gunn entered the main building at 1100 hours. The scene inside was organized chaos. Doctors and nurses moving between cots and mattresses laid on floors. Prisoners who could walk helping those who couldn't. Family members searching for each other after 3 years of separation. He scanned the room looking for Polly. Didn't see her initially. The woman lying on cot 47 looked too old, too thin, gray-haired and skeletal, and nothing like the woman he'd last seen in April 1942, when she'd been 41 years old and healthy and beautiful in the way that anyone you love is beautiful, regardless of objective measures. An Army nurse noticed him searching. "Colonel, who are you looking for?" "My wife, Polly Gunn, 4 children." The nurse pointed at cot 47. "There." Gunn walked over. The woman's eyes were closed. He stood beside the cot, studying her face, trying to reconcile memory with reality. Then she opened her eyes and looked at him. No recognition. She thought he was a doctor. The confusion was understandable. He'd lost 40 pounds. His hair had gone gray. He was using a cane. He looked nothing like the man who'd left Manila 3 years earlier. His voice came as barely more than a whisper. "Polly?" She stared at him, processing. Then her eyes widened slightly and tears started without sound, because prisoners had learned not to make noise that might attract attention from guards. "Paul?" He nodded, took her hand. It felt like holding bird bones wrapped in paper. She cried silently while he stood there, unable to speak, unable to do anything except hold her hand and understand with absolute clarity that the past 3 years had been worse than any intelligence report could communicate. His children materialized from other parts of the room. Julia, so thin that her clothes hung on her frame like fabric on a wire mannequin. Nathaniel, feverish from malaria, skin tinged yellow from liver stress. Sarah, weak from dysentery, barely able to stand. Robert, his youngest son, 7 years old now, who'd been 4 when the war started and barely remembered his father. They gathered around the cot. Nobody spoke. Words weren't adequate for circumstances that exceeded language's capacity to describe or process or make meaningful. They just held each other and cried and existed in the same physical space for the first time in 34 months. The official Army report would state, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Gunn reunited with family February 4, 1945, Santo Tomas Internment Camp, Manila. Reunion duration, 4 hours. Officer returned to duty February 5, 1945. 4 hours. Then Gunn returned to Leyte because the war wasn't over, and his medical leave hadn't expired, and men were still dying in Manila's streets as Japanese forces fought with the fanaticism of troops who knew they wouldn't survive regardless of outcome, and chose to make survival as costly as possible for the enemy. Hendricks asked him if he was okay when he returned to base. Gunn's answer came flat and emotionless in the way that extreme emotion sometimes manifests as its opposite. "They're alive. That's sufficient. What happens now? Now we finish the war." Gunn was permanently grounded from combat flying. The leg injury ended his operational career, even though he would never formally acknowledge that reality. He was reassigned to 5th Air Force Headquarters as Special Projects Officer, which was a position created specifically for him and which meant he continued developing strafer modifications while other pilots flew the missions. The modifications continued evolving through the final months of the war. New weapon systems appeared as field requirements drove innovation faster than factory production could implement. Some B-25s carried 8 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets under the wings. Unguided projectiles that traveled at 1,500 feet per second and could penetrate armor or destroy bunkers. Some carried napalm tanks that created walls of fire across enemy positions. Some carried parafrag bombs that let strafers attack from minimum altitude without risk of catching themselves in blast radius. The combined strike tactic became standard doctrine. Heavy bombers would attack from 20,000 feet, forcing anti-aircraft crews to look up. Strafers would come in low while the gunners were distracted. By the time defensive fire shifted to low-altitude threats, the strafers were already releasing weapons and aggressing at speeds that made tracking difficult and hitting nearly impossible. Between January and August 1945, 5th Air Force strafers destroyed over 900 Japanese aircraft on the ground, sank 273 ships, and killed an estimated 38,000 enemy soldiers. The numbers were precise because military bureaucracy required accounting, even for violence. Each destroyed aircraft was documented. Each sunk ship was verified through reconnaissance photographs or intelligence reports. Each casualty estimate was calculated using methodologies that attempted to quantify death with mathematical rigor. Other theaters adopted the strafer concept. In the Mediterranean, B-25s attacked German convoys supplying North Africa, using the same skip bombing techniques Gunn had developed in the Southwest Pacific. In the China-Burma-India theater, strafers interdicted Japanese supply lines along the Burma Road, destroying truck convoys and rail yards and supply depots with the systematic efficiency that defined American air power by 1945. In Europe, strafers had limited effectiveness because German anti-aircraft defenses were more sophisticated and concentrated than anything the Japanese could field, but the concept proved viable even against superior defenses. Some B-25s in the Pacific carried modifications that existed nowhere else because Gunn had invented them the night before specific missions. Extended-range fuel tanks fabricated from auxiliary drop tanks, originally designed for fighters. Improved gun cooling systems that used ram air channeled through ducting that didn't exist in factory specifications. New ammunition loading techniques that increased rate of fire by 15% through modifications to feed mechanisms that armament experts claimed couldn't be modified without complete redesign. North American Aviation hired Gunn as consulting engineer in 1948. The company was developing the B-25 Tornado, America's first operational jet bomber, and needed expertise on forward-firing armament packages. Gunn worked on gun mounting systems and fire control mechanisms and structural reinforcements required for weapons that produced recoil forces exceeding anything piston-engine bombers had handled. The company paid him consultant rates that were generous by any measure. He donated most of the money to veteran organizations that supported men who'd flown the aircraft he'd modified and survived and came home with injuries, physical or psychological or both. On July 10, 1945, General MacArthur sent a classified letter to the War Department recommending that Lieutenant Colonel Paul Gunn be promoted to Brigadier General. The letter enumerated Gunn's contributions with the dry precision of official military correspondence, technical innovations that changed how the 5th Air Force fought, combat leadership that inspired crews and validated modifications through personal example, strategic impact that directly contributed to Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific. The strafer concept had been decisive. Without it, the war would have lasted longer and cost more lives. Gunn deserved recognition commensurate with his contribution. The War Department response arrived 3 weeks later. Recommendation denied. The Army Air Force was reducing force structure as the war wound down. All promotions were frozen pending demobilization decisions about peacetime manning levels. Colonel Gunn would remain at his current rank. The letter was polite and official and absolute. General Kenny delivered the news personally when he visited Gunn at 5th Air Force headquarters in Manila, where operations had relocated after the city was secured. Kenny's expression showed the frustration of a commander who understood that bureaucracy sometimes punished success when success didn't align with administrative priorities. "Paul, I'm sorry. You deserve that star." Gunn didn't look up from the maintenance reports he was reviewing, documents detailing ongoing modifications to strafers operating from Philippine bases against remaining Japanese positions in the islands. "General, I received what I fought for. My family is free. The Philippines are liberated. The Japanese are defeated. That's sufficient. Most officers would be bitter about being passed over. I'm not most officers, and I've witnessed sufficient bitterness for one lifetime." Kenny let it drop. Some battles couldn't be won through argument or orders or appeals to fairness. The promotion recommendation was dead. Gunn would retire as a colonel. History would record his rank, but not the full measure of what he'd accomplished. Gunn retired on June 30th, 1948. Full colonel. Medical disability pension. Age 48. The official ceremony was small. A few staff officers, General Kenny reading the retirement orders, a brief speech about service and sacrifice that hit the required notes without false emotion. Gunn's decorations included the Distinguished Flying Cross with oak leaf cluster, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts accumulated through combat injuries that ranged from shrapnel wounds to the arterial damage that ended his flying career. The Distinguished Service Cross had been recommended by 3 separate commanding officers, never approved. Some evaluating officers believed Gunn's contributions were technical rather than tactical, as if the distinction mattered when the technical innovations enabled tactical victories. Others believed that enlisted veterans who later received commissions shouldn't receive the same recognition as officers who'd been commissioned from the beginning, as if the path mattered more than the destination. General Kenny wrote in his memoir, published in 1949, Pappy Gunn was the most valuable man in the 5th Air Force. His mechanical genius and combat innovations changed the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific. Without his strafer modifications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea would have been a Japanese victory. Without Bismarck Sea, we would have lost New Guinea. Without New Guinea, the road to the Philippines would have been impossible. The assessment was accurate, also insufficient. Numbers couldn't capture what Gunn had done because the impact extended beyond statistics into domains that defied quantification. He'd changed how air forces thought about bombers. He'd proven that field innovation could outpace factory design. He'd demonstrated that operational requirements should drive engineering, rather than engineering constraining operations. Gunn returned to the Philippines after retirement and rebuilt Philippine Airlines. He'd founded the airline in 1941 with 5 Beechcraft planes operating inter-island routes. The Japanese occupation had destroyed everything. He started over in 1946 with 3 war-surplus C-47 Dakota transports purchased from the Army at prices that reflected the government's desire to dispose of thousands of aircraft no longer needed for military operations. The routes initially covered Manila to Cebu to Davao to Zamboanga, the major population centers in the Philippines that needed air service because road networks were damaged or non-existent and maritime transport was slow. By 1948, Philippine Airlines operated 10 DC-3 aircraft on domestic routes. By 1950, the fleet had grown to include DC-4 long-range aircraft capable of international routes. By 1952, Convair 340 pressurized aircraft provided comfort that pre-war aviation had never achieved. By 1955, routes extended to Hong Kong, Bangkok, and Singapore. By 1956, Philippine Airlines operated trans-Pacific service to San Francisco. The transformation from 5 Beechcraft planes to an international carrier happened because Gunn applied the same principles to business that he'd applied to aircraft modification. Identify requirements, develop solutions, test through implementation, iterate based on results. He flew constantly, Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Davao, Davao to Hong Kong. He couldn't stop moving. The war had taught him that movement meant survival and stagnation meant death. Some of his pilots noticed that Colonel Gunn still flew like he was outrunning something, checking over his shoulder, scanning the horizon, unable to relax even in peacetime skies where the only threats were weather and mechanical failure rather than enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Carlos Reyes, a Filipino pilot who flew for Philippine Airlines through the 1950s, would later recall, Colonel Gunn was always moving, always checking, always planning the next route or the next aircraft purchase or the next expansion. Some of us thought he was still fighting the war, still trying to get somewhere faster than the enemy could stop him. The observation was perceptive. Gunn had never left Santo Tomas. Not really. He'd physically departed but mentally remained in that camp where his family had starved for 3 years. The faces of prisoners haunted him. So did the faces of crews who'd flown his modified aircraft and never came back. The mathematics of war included emotional costs that couldn't be calculated or paid off or forgotten, no matter how many years passed. The Philippine government awarded Gunn the Distinguished Service Star in 1947. President Manuel Roxas presented the medal personally at a ceremony in Malacañang Palace, attended by government officials and American veterans and Filipino citizens who remembered liberation and wanted to honor the men who'd made it possible. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and exceptional service to the Republic of the Philippines during the Liberation Campaign, Colonel Gunn's innovative modifications to Allied aircraft directly contributed to the defeat of Japanese forces and the freedom of the Filipino people." The recognition was genuine, also incomplete. Gunn's contribution extended beyond the Liberation Campaign into the Reconstruction period when his airline provided transportation infrastructure that helped rebuild an economy devastated by 3 years of occupation and 6 months of urban warfare that had destroyed Manila more thoroughly than any city except Warsaw. The military legacy of Gunn's innovations became apparent in subsequent wars. The AC-130 gunship that operated in Vietnam was a direct descendant of the B-25 strafer concept. Side-firing 20mm cannons and 40mm autocannons, and even a 105mm howitzer mounted on a C-130 transport created a flying weapons platform capable of sustained fire support. The doctrine was identical to what Gunn had proven in 1943, overwhelming defensive positions with concentrated firepower delivered from an aircraft platform. The A-10 and Thunderbolt II, introduced in the 1970s, embodied Gunn's philosophy of building an aircraft around a gun rather than adding guns to an aircraft. The GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannon fired 4,200 rounds per minute. The aircraft was literally designed around the weapon, with structural elements positioned to absorb recoil and feed systems engineered to sustain fire rates that exceeded anything previous attack aircraft had achieved. The A-10 was a strafer in the purest sense, an aircraft whose primary purpose was putting rounds on target with accuracy and volume that made defense impossible. Modern attack helicopters, from the AH-64 Apache to the AH-1 Cobra to every other variant developed by militaries worldwide, all incorporated forward-firing armament packages and multi-role capabilities that traced directly to concepts Gunn had validated through field modifications done with hand tools in Australian hangars. The lineage was clear to anyone who studied tactical aviation history. On October 10, 1957, Gunn chartered a Beechcraft Model 18 twin-engine aircraft for a flight from Manila to Baguio. The trip was routine, 140 miles north into the mountains, where Baguio provided cool temperatures and mountain scenery and respite from Manila's tropical heat. The weather forecast showed scattered thunderstorms over the Cordillera Mountains, but nothing severe enough to delay travel. He filed his flight plan at 0800 hours. Departure scheduled for 0930. Expected arrival 1100. The tower cleared him for takeoff at 0928. Weather deteriorated faster than forecast predicted. By 10:30, the Cordillera Mountains were obscured by clouds that reached from ridge lines down to valley floors. Heavy rain, low visibility, turbulence that made instrument flying challenging even for experienced pilots. The Beechcraft's radio went silent at 10:47 hours. Search and rescue teams launched within 30 minutes, but found nothing in weather that grounded most aircraft. The storm cleared on October 13th. Search aircraft spotted wreckage on a mountainside near Baguio. The impact site showed that the Beechcraft had flown into a storm cell, attempted to climb above it, and been driven into the ridge by winds that exceeded the aircraft's climb performance. Impact killed everyone aboard instantly. No survivors. Paul Irvin Gunn died on October 11, 1957. He was 57 years old. His 58th birthday would have been the following week. The Philippine government provided a state funeral. 6,000 people attended. American veterans who'd flown his strafers. Philippine Airlines employees who'd worked for a man who demanded excellence, but rewarded loyalty. Former prisoners from Santo Tomas, who remembered that liberation had come partly because one man had refused to stop fighting until his family was free. Filipino citizens who understood that some Americans had fought for the Philippines not as colonial masters, but as people who believed freedom mattered regardless of nationality. General Kenny sent a wreath from the United States. The card read simply, "To Pappy, you changed everything." The Manila Times published Gunn's obituary on October 12th. The headline read, "War Hero Dies in Plane Crash." The article mentioned his distinguished flying cross, his role in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, his liberation missions over the Philippines. The text was factual and respectful and inadequate. No newspaper article could capture what Gunn had accomplished because the scale exceeded journalistic conventions for obituaries. The numbers provided partial truth. 5,000 B-25 strafers built incorporating his modifications. 800 Japanese ships sunk by strafers. 2,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 85,000 enemy soldiers killed. The statistics were accurate and verified through military records. They represented destruction measured in tons of shipping sunk and airframes destroyed and casualties inflicted. But statistics couldn't capture the human dimension of a man who'd fought a war to save his family and ended up changing how wars were fought. The real impact lived in the doctrine that survived him. Before Gunn, bombers attacked from altitude using precision bomb sights and hoping for accuracy. After Gunn, bombers became multi-role weapons capable of strafing and skip bombing and close air support and interdiction. The transformation wasn't just tactical, it was conceptual. Air power could be applied in ways that previous doctrine had never contemplated. Innovation could come from mechanics and field modifications as easily as from engineers and wind tunnels. Combat results mattered more than credentials. Gunn's son Nathaniel joined the Air Force after graduating from the academy. He flew B-52 bombers during Vietnam, missions that lasted 12 hours and covered thousands of miles and delivered ordnance in quantities that would have seemed incomprehensible during World War II. He retired as a colonel in 1983. In 1994, he published a book titled Pappy Gunn, Forever Free. The book sold 12,000 copies. Most Americans had never heard of Paul Gunn. The name meant nothing to people born after 1960 who grew up in a world where American air superiority was assumed rather than fought for, where the tactical innovations of World War II were distant history rather than living memory. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, displays one of Gunn's original gun-mounting drawings. The paper is yellowed from age and handling. The measurements are handwritten in pencil because Gunn never had access to proper drafting equipment during the early development phase in Australia. The sketch shows 4 50 caliber guns mounted inside an A-20 nose compartment with notes about weight distribution and center of gravity compensation. No stress calculations, no computer modeling, no wind tunnel validation. Just a drawing that proved theory through implementation and killed 8,000 Japanese soldiers at Bismarck Sea. The Air Force Association inducted Gunn into the Air Force Enlisted Heritage Hall in 2008. The citation mentioned his innovations, his combat record, his influence on modern attack aviation. The ceremony was held in Washington. 3 of his grandchildren attended, middle-aged professionals who'd grown up hearing stories about a grandfather they'd never met, stories that seemed almost mythological in scope, a mechanic who became a warrior, an engineer who outthought experts, a father who fought across a theater to save his family. The stories were true, that was the remarkable part. Everything that seemed too dramatic to be real had actually happened. Philippine Airlines still operates today. The airline flies to 42 destinations across Asia, Australia, and North America. Annual passenger volume exceeds 15 million. The corporate headquarters in Manila contains a portrait of Gunn in the main lobby. Most employees don't know who he is. The institutional memory has faded as decades passed, and original staff retired or died and were replaced by people who'd never heard the stories about how the airline started with 5 Beechcraft planes and a man who understood that flight meant more than transportation. It meant connection and commerce and the infrastructure that turns geography into opportunity. The portrait shows Gunn in his Army Air Force uniform, colonel's eagles on his shoulders, ribbons on his chest, the slight smile of someone who knows something the camera can't capture. The painting was done in 1952 based on photographs from the war years. It shows a man aged beyond his years by stress and combat and the weight of responsibility for innovations that saved lives by taking other lives more efficiently. Military historians who study the Pacific War understand what Gunn accomplished. The strafer doctrine changed the operational environment in ways that forced Japanese adaptation and ultimately contributed to their defeat. But historians write for other historians. The general public doesn't read tactical innovation studies or weapons development analyses. They remember MacArthur wading ashore at Leyte and Nimitz accepting surrender aboard the Missouri and mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They don't remember the mechanic who figured out how to mount tank guns on bombers or the field modifications that proved engineering could happen anywhere if the requirements were clear and the motivation sufficient. That's the tragedy of history. The big moments get remembered. The small moments that made the big moments possible get forgotten. Paul Gunn changed how America fights wars. His innovations live on in every modern attack aircraft. His doctrine still guides close air support operations. His refusal to accept that impossible meant impossible rather than hasn't been done yet resonates through military culture wherever field innovation challenges bureaucratic resistance. But most people don't know his name, don't know what he did, don't understand that wars are won by individuals who refuse to accept defeat even when experts say victory is impossible. Gunn proved that expertise without implementation is worthless, and implementation without expertise can succeed if the implementer understands the operational requirements better than the experts understand the theory. He deserves to be remembered, not for the sake of his ego, he's dead and doesn't care, but for the sake of everyone who follows and needs to understand that innovation comes from necessity and courage, comes from love, and victory comes from refusing to quit even when every rational analysis suggests quitting is the only sensible option. Paul Gunn didn't quit. He fought. He innovated. He flew. He survived. He saved his family. He changed the war. He died doing what he'd always done, flying towards something better. That's legacy enough for any man, whether history remembers his name or not.